In May 1968, USS Scorpion was crossing the Atlantic toward Norfolk after a secretive Cold War deployment, carrying 99 men through waters southwest of the Azores. Its final confirmed message gave no warning of danger. Then the submarine stopped answering, failed to arrive, and left behind only silence, uncertain radio traffic, and sounds recorded deep beneath the ocean. You will follow that last transmission through distant naval stations, the widening search, the acoustic evidence hidden in Cold War recordings, and the wreck eventually found more than 10,000 feet below. Yet the closer the investigation moves towards Scorpion, the more one question remains. How could a submarine be located, photographed, and studied while the cause of its final descent remained missing? The submarine that never reached Norfolk. On the afternoon of May 27, 1968, a pier in Norfolk, Virginia, was prepared for an arrival that should have required no explanation. Families gathered near the submarine tender USS Orion, watching the harbour and waiting for the dark, narrow outline of a nuclear submarine to appear from the approaches to Hampton Roads. The scheduled hour was 1 o'clock. The deployment had lasted more than 3 months, and the men aboard USS Scorpion were expected to return from the Mediterranean in time for embraces, photographs, and the ordinary movement of sailors stepping back onto land. Yet the water beyond the pier remained undisturbed, and as the appointed time passed, the absence began to feel less like a delay and more like a question no one at the waterfront was prepared to ask. At first, there was room for explanations. Warships did not always arrive precisely when announced, and submarines were especially difficult to follow from shore because their movements were controlled, their communications limited, and much of their work concealed by necessity. An engine problem, changed orders, weather, or a delay farther out in the Atlantic could all keep a boat from entering port on schedule. Those waiting could not see what was happening inside naval offices nearby, where the concern had begun before the pier understood it. Scorpion had not merely missed the sight of Norfolk on the horizon, it had also failed to answer routine messages sent to determine whether it was still proceeding home. The Navy had publicly released Scorpion's expected arrival time only 3 days earlier, allowing relatives to know when they could come to the destroyer submarine piers off Hampton Boulevard. That announcement carried an assumption powerful enough to shape the entire scene. Somewhere beneath or upon the Atlantic, the submarine was still moving west. Its commanding officer, Commander Francis A. Slattery, had reported an estimated arrival in Norfolk at 1 p.m. on May 27th. Nothing in the notice to the families suggested that the homecoming might be uncertain. No warning had been issued at the pier, and no visible emergency had yet replaced the quiet expectation of a boat approaching its berth. Behind that expectation, however, the communication trail had already gone cold. Scorpion's last confirmed position report had placed it near the Azores while returning from its Mediterranean deployment. The submarine had been operating under conditions in which periods without contact were not automatically alarming. Attack submarines were designed to remain hidden, and transmitting could reveal more than a commander wished an opponent to know. Radio silence therefore created a dangerous ambiguity. The same lack of communication that protected a submarine during normal operations could conceal the moment when normal operations had ended. By May 24th, officers in the Atlantic Submarine Command were aware that Scorpion had failed to respond to classified traffic. The submarine's estimated arrival remained unchanged, and until it missed that time, uncertainty could still be contained within naval procedure. There was no confirmed distress call, no surfaced wreckage, and no witness reporting an accident. The boat existed, as far as those on land could prove, only through its planned course, its last messages, and the belief that it was continuing toward Virginia. Each unanswered transmission weakened that belief, but none could show what had replaced it. At Pier 22, the scheduled hour passed without the familiar signals of an arriving submarine. No tug moved into position to assist it. No low hull appeared in the channel. No sailors climbed onto the casing as the boat neared home. The families could only continue looking toward the water, while officials faced a widening separation between what had been announced and what was now visible. A homecoming had become an overdue arrival, and an overdue arrival was beginning to become something the Navy treated with far greater seriousness. The acting commander of Submarine Squadron 6, Scorpion's unit, reported that the submarine had not answered routine communications. Attempts to establish contact intensified, but calling a submerged boat across an ocean was not like placing a telephone call and waiting for someone to pick up. Messages had to reach a submarine equipped to receive them, operating where expected and still capable of responding. Every repeated call carried the same hidden uncertainty. Scorpion might have been unable to transmit. It might have been delayed beyond its predicted track, or there might no longer have been anyone aboard capable of hearing the signal. At 3:15 that afternoon, more than 2 hours after the expected arrival, the Navy declared a submarine missing. The designation transformed the situation from a private concern into an organised emergency. Commands were alerted, communication stations searched their records, and ships and aircraft began preparing to look across an immense area of ocean. But the declaration did not reveal where Scorpion was. It only acknowledged that the Navy had lost the ability to account for one of its own nuclear submarines and every man inside it. Nothing about the first hours offered searchers an obvious place to begin. Scorpion had crossed thousands of miles of water since leaving the Mediterranean, and its last known communications did not provide a continuous record of its route. The submarine could change depth, speed, and direction without leaving a visible trail. On the surface, ships could be located by aircraft, radar, smoke, or lights. Beneath the Atlantic, a vessel built for concealment could disappear inside the very environment it had been designed to use. News of the missing submarine spread beyond the restricted world of naval command, but official language remained cautious. The boat was overdue. A search was underway. Hope could not yet be dismissed, because no wreck had been found and no final event had been confirmed. Mechanical failure might have forced Scorpion to remain silent. A communications casualty might have prevented a reply. The submarine might even have been on the surface somewhere beyond the searcher's immediate reach. Each possibility allowed families to imagine survival, while the Navy confronted the darker fact that a disabled submarine had only limited ways to announce where it had stopped. As evening approached over Norfolk, the empty berth became the first undeniable evidence of the disaster, though no one could yet describe what the disaster was. The families who had arrived expecting reunion left without the men they had come to meet, while the Atlantic opened before search planners as a field of unanswered distances. Somewhere between the Azores and Virginia, Scorpion had passed beyond routine communication and failed to emerge at the one place where its presence could no longer remain secret. The missing vessel was not an abstraction on a chart, but a sealed world carrying 99 separate lives beneath the Atlantic. 99 men inside a nuclear hull. Behind the missing submarine's designation were 99 individual lives, each tied to someone ashore who believed the separation was almost over. On naval charts, USS Scorpion could be reduced to a hull number, a projected course, and a last reported position somewhere in the Atlantic, but none of those markings revealed what had actually vanished. Inside the submarine were officers and enlisted men with different ranks, ages, responsibilities, and lengths of service, all confined within the same narrow boundary of steel. For more than 3 months, that enclosed world had carried them far from Norfolk, while their families measured the distance in letters, interrupted routines, and the expectation that the deployment would soon end. Within that sealed steel world, the crew functioned as a complete community whose survival depended on every man performing his role correctly. A submarine could not be operated by isolated specialists working only when called upon. It demanded continuous coordination between those navigating, maintaining propulsion, monitoring electrical systems, handling communications, tracking contacts, preparing food, caring for equipment, and standing watches at every hour. The men lived close enough to hear activity from adjoining spaces and worked within systems that connected one compartment to another, creating a form of dependence rarely experienced aboard larger ships. Privacy was limited, movement was controlled, and nearly every routine took place within reach of another sailor's station. Command of the submarine rested with Commander Francis Atwood Slattery, the officer responsible for its movements, its mission, and everyone enclosed inside it. His authority reached from the control room to the machinery spaces and torpedo room, but command beneath the surface also depended upon trust in men whose technical knowledge covered areas no single officer could personally supervise at every moment. Later testimony before the Navy's Court of Inquiry described the crew as trained, able, and mature, a finding that mattered because the disappearance would eventually generate theories questioning almost every system aboard. Whatever happened during the final hours, the available record did not portray 99 men entering the Atlantic unprepared for ordinary submarine operations. Across the remaining compartments served officers, chiefs, technicians, and enlisted specialists whose separate duties formed one interdependent system. Sonar operators listened for contacts that could not be seen through the hull. Radio men handled communications that might arrive only during carefully managed periods. Torpedo men maintained weapons and equipment in the forward section, while electricians, machinists' mates, and engineering personnel kept the machinery supporting propulsion and life below the surface functioning. Cooks worked in one of the few spaces associated with a familiar daily rhythm, though meals had to be prepared within severe limits of room and storage. Each man occupied a place in the organisation, but a casualty anywhere aboard could quickly become the concern of everyone. Life inside the pressure hull unfolded through narrow passageways, crowded workspaces, stacked bunks, ladders, and watertight openings dividing one section from the next. The submarine was not simply a vessel that travelled underwater. For the duration of a submerged period, it became the crew's complete physical environment. The same interior held their sleeping spaces, meals, work, machinery, weapons, communications, and the air they continued to breathe. Personal movement took place around pipes, controls, cables, gauges, and equipment that could not be moved aside for comfort. Even rest occurred within a working machine, close to men beginning another watch while others attempted to sleep. Daylight had little meaning below the surface, where rotating watches governed when the men worked, ate, rested, and returned to their stations. The ocean outside could be bright with afternoon sun or dark beneath a moonless sky, yet the crew experienced time through clocks, orders, meals, and relief at the end of a watch. Artificial lighting remained constant unless altered for operational reasons, and there were no windows through which the passage of weather or distance could be observed. A sailor might know from navigation reports that the submarine had crossed another part of the Atlantic, but the immediate world around him could appear almost unchanged. Mechanical noise surrounded nearly every part of their routine, from ventilation and pumps to electrical equipment and the controlled sounds of sonar operations. Some noises belonged to systems operating normally and would have become so familiar that their absence might attract more attention than their presence. Others required immediate interpretation, because an unusual vibration, alarm, or change in machinery could indicate a problem developing beyond sight. Submariners learned the character of their boat partly through sound, recognizing the difference between normal operation and something that demanded investigation. In an environment where the sea itself remained invisible, listening was not merely part of the atmosphere, it was a means of understanding what surrounded them. Nothing inside the submarine was truly ordinary, because every breath and movement depended on machinery, maintaining conditions the Atlantic would not permit naturally. Air had to remain breathable, electrical power available, temperatures controlled, and seawater kept outside the pressure hull despite the force pressing against it. Yet the crew could not spend every hour consciously fearing those conditions. Procedures, training, maintenance, and repetition transformed an inherently hostile environment into a workplace where men could eat, joke, read, write, and sleep between watches. The danger remained present, but routine made it possible to live beside that danger without allowing it to dominate every moment. Connections to home had to be carried in small forms, limited by the scarce personal space available aboard an attack submarine. Letters and photographs could cross the distance that voices usually could not, preserving ordinary details from households continuing without the men deployed at sea. Communication with family was not immediate, and a message written aboard might describe circumstances already past by the time it was received. That delay created two separate versions of time: life inside the submarine, advancing through watches and orders, and life ashore where families waited for news that had begun its journey days or weeks earlier. Back on land, the families had begun measuring the deployment in remaining hours rather than distant weeks or months. Scorpion had been away for approximately 3.5 months, and the Navy's announcement of its expected arrival allowed wives, children, parents, girlfriends, and other relatives to prepare for a specific homecoming. The uncertainty that belonged to ordinary submarine operations seemed to have narrowed toward a fixed point at Norfolk. Whatever had occurred during the deployment was assumed to be ending, and the final separation appeared to consist only of the distance still left between the submarine and the Virginia coast. Norfolk represented more than the end of a voyage. It promised the return of familiar routines suspended since the submarine sailed. The crew would leave the compressed order of watches, machinery and shared compartments for houses where doors opened into separate rooms and daylight arrived without being announced by a clock. Families expected conversations that no longer had to be written, meals that were not served beneath the ocean, and the simple presence of men whose absence had shaped daily life for months. None of these expectations needed to be remarkable. Their importance came from how close they appeared to becoming real. After the expected arrival passed, differences in rank, specialty and responsibility gave way to the same uncertainty inside 99 households. The commander, officers, chiefs, technicians, cooks, radio men, sonar operators, torpedo men and engineering personnel were no longer separated by what they had done aboard. To those waiting, each had become part of the same unanswered absence. The Navy could organise searches, review communications and reconstruct a projected route, but families could not translate those procedures into certainty about a husband, father, son, brother or fiancé. A submarine had failed to return, and the human scale of that failure extended far beyond the number recorded in official reports. Understanding why these men had been placed inside such a vessel required looking beyond their routines and into the purpose built into the submarine around them. Their confined existence had not been created merely to cross the Atlantic unseen, and the machinery surrounding them had not been assembled only to sustain life beneath the surface. Every station, watch and trained specialty belonged to a larger design shaped by the tensions of an era in which nations followed one another through deep water while publicly revealing almost nothing. Around them was a machine created for a hidden contest in which remaining unseen could matter as much as surviving. Built to hunt beneath the Cold War, USS Scorpion was not designed simply to carry men beneath the ocean or to travel between distant ports without surfacing. It belonged to a class of vessels built for a battlefield that could not be observed from the shore, where opposing submarines searched for one another through darkness, pressure, and miles of cold water. Its success depended on reaching an unseen contact, determining what it was doing, and remaining close without revealing that an American submarine had entered the same stretch of sea. The hull surrounding the crew was therefore more than transportation. It was a weapon whose most important advantage could disappear the moment another vessel knew exactly where it was. Unlike earlier submarines designed to spend much of their passage on the surface, Scorpion belonged to a generation built around submerged performance. It was one of 6 skipjack-class nuclear attack submarines, a type that combined nuclear propulsion with a streamlined hull form developed from research conducted through the experimental submarine USS Albacore. Older submarines had often retained features influenced by the need to move efficiently on the surface, but the skipjack class reflected a different assumption. The vessel's true operating environment was below. Its rounded bow and smooth profile gave it an appearance unlike the long-decked silhouettes associated with many wartime boats, announcing through shape alone that submarine warfare had entered another era. Its smooth teardrop hull concealed the complexity inside while reducing the resistance that had limited older boats beneath the water. The form allowed water to pass around the submarine with fewer interruptions, supporting higher speed and sharper maneuvering while submerged. A single propeller drove the vessel from the stern, and the outer shape was kept comparatively clean because every projection could create drag, noise, or turbulence. Those qualities were not pursued merely to establish engineering records. A submarine that could accelerate, turn, or alter depth quickly gained options during a contact that a slower opponent might not possess. It could close the distance, move away from danger, or change its position before the vessel listening for it had formed a reliable picture of where it would go next. Above the rounded pressure hull, control surfaces mounted on the sail helped the vessel change depth and direction through an environment without visible boundaries. Beneath the surface, there were no landmarks and no horizon through which movement could be judged directly. The submarine travelled through 3 dimensions, able to turn across the ocean while also rising or descending within it. Depth had to be controlled deliberately, and every change affected the way sound moved between the submarine and whatever might be listening nearby. Maneuverability was therefore tied to more than navigation. It influenced whether Scorpion could hold a useful position on another vessel, avoid entering an unfavourable one, or respond quickly when an unseen contact changed course. Farther aft, a nuclear reactor removed one of the most restrictive demands faced by earlier submarines: the repeated need to return toward the air above. The Skipjack class used an S5W pressurized water reactor to produce the power that drove its propulsion system and supported operations aboard. Diesel-electric submarines depended on batteries when submerged, and eventually had to surface or raise a snorkel to run diesel engines and recharge them. A nuclear submarine did not require atmospheric oxygen to power its reactor, allowing it to remain beneath the surface for extended periods, rather than exposing itself at regular intervals merely to continue moving. That freedom fundamentally altered what a submarine could attempt and how long it could remain difficult to locate. Freed from regular surfacing for propulsion, the boat could remain submerged across distances that changed how both missions and searches had to be planned. Its endurance was not literally without limit, because food, maintenance, equipment, and the physical needs of the crew still imposed restrictions. But the old connection between propulsion and access to outside air had been broken. An enemy could no longer assume that the submarine would eventually be forced toward the surface along a predictable route. Scorpion could cross large areas underwater, alter its track without leaving a visible wake for aircraft to follow, and continue operating while the world above received little indication of where it had gone. Extraordinary underwater speed gave the submarine another advantage, allowing it to pursue a contact, evade detection, or reposition before an opponent understood its movement. The Navy described the first vessel of the class, USS Skipjack, as the world's fastest submarine, although exact performance figures remained classified and public estimates varied. Scorpion shared the same basic combination of reactor power and hydrodynamic form that made the class remarkable during its early years. Speed, however, carried meaning only when applied carefully. Moving rapidly could increase machinery and flow noise, making the submarine easier to hear, while reducing speed could help it listen more effectively and become harder to detect. The crew had to balance motion against concealment, choosing when power mattered more than quiet. Vision offered almost nothing beneath the Atlantic, so the surrounding ocean had to be interpreted through sound, bearing changes, and the machinery signatures of unseen vessels. Sonar operators listened for propellers, pumps, turbines, and other noises travelling through the water, sometimes at distances where the source could not be identified immediately. Passive sonar allowed the submarine to listen without transmitting a signal that might reveal its own presence, but listening alone did not produce a complete answer. A sound had to be separated from background noise compared with known characteristics, and followed long enough for changes in bearing to suggest direction and movement. The ocean could carry sound far beyond sight, yet it could also bend, distort, and conceal it. From faint acoustic traces and instrument readings, the men in the control spaces assembled an invisible battlefield one report at a time. The commanding officer could not look through glass and see another submarine approaching. Instead, information arrived as bearings, estimated ranges, course changes, depth readings, speed adjustments, and reports passed between stations. Navigation, sonar, propulsion, and command had to work together until scattered observations became a usable picture. Even then, uncertainty remained. Two submarines could occupy the same region without either knowing the other's exact position, each interpreting fragments while trying not to create fragments of its own for the other to hear. Forward of those stations waited 6 torpedo tubes, giving every successful approach the possibility of becoming an attack. The tubes were positioned in the bow, connecting the submarine's ability to detect and follow an adversary with the power to strike it from beneath the surface. Torpedoes could be prepared, loaded, and launched without the target ever seeing the vessel that had fired them. Their presence gave meaning to the patient work of sonar tracking and covert maneuvering, because a submarine that entered a favourable position during war could transform hidden contact into sudden destruction. In peacetime operations, the same capability made every close encounter between opposing submarines part surveillance, part rehearsal, and part warning. Among the weapons carried aboard were torpedoes whose destructive power reflected how deeply nuclear strategy had entered the oceans by the late 1960s. Scorpion carried conventional weapons as well as nuclear-capable Mark 45 Astor anti-submarine torpedoes designed for use against submerged targets. 2 nuclear weapons were aboard when the submarine was lost, although their later condition and location belonged to the investigation of the wreck rather than the vessel's original purpose. The important fact was what their presence represented. The Cold War beneath the sea was not merely a contest of observation. The submarines watching one another possessed the means to turn that concealed contest into a nuclear engagement. Combined together, Speed, endurance, sonar, firepower, and secrecy turned the submarine into a platform designed to find another hidden vessel before being found itself. Fast attack submarines could screen naval forces, follow opposing submarines, gather intelligence, participate in exercises, and prepare for missions that might become combat with little warning. Much of their usefulness rested on proximity without acknowledgement. A successful patrol could produce no public event, because the achievement might consist entirely of reaching an adversary, remaining near it, learning from it, and leaving without confirming that the encounter had taken place. Isolation was therefore not an accidental condition of the mission, but one of the qualities that made the boat useful in the first place. Scorpion could operate far from visible support, submerged beneath international waters, while only a limited number of people ashore understood its orders or projected route. That separation protected classified operations and complicated an opponent's attempt to track the vessel, but it also created a dangerous consequence. When a submarine built to disappear suffered trouble, the same concealment that protected it could prevent others from recognizing the emergency until the opportunity to help had already passed. Design specifications could explain what Scorpion was supposed to withstand, but they could not reveal what years of demanding service had left unresolved inside the hull. Its shape remained streamlined, its reactor still offered extraordinary endurance, and its weapons still represented the power expected of a nuclear attack submarine. Yet advanced design did not preserve every component indefinitely. Behind the appearance of one of the Navy's fastest underwater hunters was an individual vessel with its own maintenance history, accumulated strain, and conditions that could not be understood by examining the class on paper. Long before the final voyage the hunter built to disappear beneath the Atlantic had begun carrying weaknesses that its streamlined exterior could never show. A submarine already carrying troubling secrets. Hidden beneath Scorpion's streamlined exterior was a repair history that would later seem far more troubling than it had before the submarine vanished. Nothing visible from the pier revealed which systems had been postponed, which limits had been imposed, or which deficiencies had been accepted because the vessel was still considered capable of carrying out its assigned work. Only after the submarine failed to return did old maintenance decisions begin to look like possible warnings, preserved in records that could show what had been wrong but not whether any of it had caused the loss. The distinction would become central to the mystery. Scorpion had known problems, yet no investigation could prove that one of those problems destroyed it. 5 years earlier, the loss of USS Thresher had already shown the Navy how a mechanical failure deep underwater could become irreversible within minutes. On April 10, 1963, the nuclear submarine sank during deep diving trials with all 129 people aboard, forcing the Navy to reconsider how submarines were built, inspected, repaired, and certified. The disaster demonstrated that a relatively limited failure could spread through interconnected systems until a submarine lost the ability to stop flooding or reach the surface. In response, the Navy created a program intended to prevent another boat from entering deep water, without stronger evidence that its most critical systems could survive. From that disaster emerged SubSafe, a demanding program intended to prevent flooding, control it when it occurred, and preserve a submarine's ability to reach the surface. The program required strict documentation of materials, inspections of welds and seawater systems, testing of critical components, and certification that safety-related work had been performed according to approved procedures. Its purpose was not to eliminate every mechanical problem aboard a submarine, which no maintenance system could guarantee, but to protect the pressure hull and the systems needed to recover from a serious casualty. The new standards offered greater assurance, yet they also required time, shipyard space, trained personnel, and extensive work. By the time those new requirements reached Charleston Naval Shipyard, Scorpion's major overhaul was already too far advanced for every modification to be completed immediately. The boat had entered the yard in June 1963, only weeks after Thresher was lost and returned to service in 1964. Because the safety program was still being developed while the overhaul was underway, some changes could not simply be inserted into work already approaching completion. Instead, parts of the new package were deferred until a later availability, leaving Scorpion in the uneasy position of operating under standards that were changing faster than the submarine could be rebuilt to meet them. Several protections introduced after Thresher were consequently postponed, leaving essential improvements scheduled for a later period rather than installed at once. Published accounts of the maintenance record describe unfinished modifications to systems intended to isolate seawater flooding rapidly and concerns surrounding the emergency main ballast tank blow arrangement, which was critical to forcing water from the ballast tanks during an emergency ascent. These omissions did not prove that the submarine was incapable of surfacing or that a flooding casualty was inevitable, but they meant the boat lacked the complete package of improvements being introduced across the fleet. Cold War demands made those delays more than a technical decision, because every submarine held in a shipyard was one less vessel available for operational commitments. Nuclear attack submarines were needed to train, gather intelligence, follow Soviet forces, protect naval groups, and maintain a presence in waters where the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union rarely became public. At the same time, the growing scope of sub-safe work threatened to keep boats unavailable for increasingly long periods. The Navy therefore faced two dangers that did not point in the same direction: returning a submarine to sea before every improvement was completed, or leaving too much of the fleet tied to the pier while Soviet submarine activity continued. Caught between safety standards and fleet requirements, Scorpion became part of an effort to shorten the time nuclear submarines remained unavailable for service. In February 1967, it entered what was described as a reduced availability overhaul rather than receiving the full range of work that might ordinarily have accompanied a major refueling and modernization period. The approach was intended to return the submarine to operational duty sooner, with additional repairs and modifications deferred. Accounts published by the US Naval Institute describe the work as unusually limited and shaped by shortages of shipyard personnel and resources. During the reduced overhaul that began in 1967, the boat received limited work while other repairs and modifications were deferred beyond its next deployment. Much of the maintenance reportedly had to be performed by the crew and submarine tender personnel rather than entirely by the naval shipyard. When Scorpion emerged, it was again able to train and prepare for overseas service, but its return to operation did not mean every concern had disappeared. The vessel had passed the level of inspection required for the Navy to send it back to sea, while still carrying work intended for another period. Full subsafe certification remained incomplete when the submarine returned to duty, creating a distinction between being operationally cleared and meeting every newer safety requirement. That distinction is easy to misread after a disaster. Lack of full certification did not automatically mean that Scorpion was considered unseaworthy, because submarines already in service were being modified over time as shipyard schedules permitted. Yet it also meant the boat did not possess every protection the Navy had judged important enough to require after Thresher. The gap would later allow critics to argue that operational urgency had been permitted to outrun safety. Weeks before the final deployment, Commander Francis Slattery submitted concerns about the vessel's condition that would later acquire a far darker significance. Published accounts quote his maintenance request as warning that postponing additional work could endanger the submarine's material readiness, particularly as deterioration continued in areas requiring preservation and repair. Such language did not declare the boat immediately unsafe, and commanding officers routinely documented deficiencies they wanted corrected. After the loss, however, the request became evidence that Scorpion's captain had entered the deployment, aware that the vessel needed more attention than it had received. Reported valve leakage imposed limits on the submarine's authorized operating depth, proving that known deficiencies were already affecting how it could be used. Accounts of the final deployment describe Scorpion as observing a depth restriction of roughly 500 feet, far shallower than the greater depth associated with the design's normal capability. A restricted depth did not mean the pressure hull was about to fail, and submarines could continue carrying out many missions without approaching maximum depth. Even so, the limitation removed part of the underwater space that might otherwise have been available for maneuvering, evasion, or recovering from trouble. Taken separately, the remaining faults could appear to be ordinary maintenance problems, but together they formed a pattern that later investigators could not easily ignore. Reports have described refrigeration leaks, hydraulic or seawater system concerns, electrical trouble, and other defects encountered during the submarine's final period of service. Complex warships regularly carried maintenance discrepancies, and crews were trained to manage faults while repairs were scheduled. The unresolved question was whether Scorpion's list remained within that normal reality, or had crossed into a condition where several manageable problems could combine during one emergency. Informal recollections added another layer of uncertainty, including the nickname Scrap Iron, which suggested a reputation more severe than official records acknowledged. The name has appeared in later accounts describing frustration among sailors familiar with the submarine's recurring mechanical problems. Yet a nickname is not an engineering report, and recollections recorded after a catastrophic loss can be shaped by what happened later. It revealed that some people remembered the boat as troublesome, but it could not identify the system that failed or prove that the crew believed they were sailing in a vessel likely to be lost. Against that troubling evidence stood the Navy's formal conclusion that the submarine's material condition had been excellent and that delayed sub-safe work had not caused the loss. The Court of Inquiry examined the submarine's maintenance, qualifications, personnel and operational history, but it could not establish a definitive cause from the evidence then available. Later, official reviews continued to consider flooding and other internal casualties without proving that incomplete sub-safe modifications were responsible. The Navy's position therefore resisted the claim that Scorpion had been knowingly sent to sea in a condition that directly caused its destruction. Neither position resolved the central problem, because documented weaknesses did not prove which system failed, while official uncertainty could not erase the warnings already recorded. It was possible for the submarine to have maintenance deficiencies and still be lost through an unrelated event. It was also possible that a problem considered manageable at the time became important during a casualty no survivor could describe. Without a recovered crew, complete internal records from the final minutes, or physical access to every damaged system, the difference between background condition and fatal cause remained impossible to settle. Despite the unanswered questions surrounding its condition, Scorpion was declared ready and sent across the Atlantic for another demanding assignment. Its crew completed training, passed through the preparations required for deployment, and departed Norfolk on February 15, 1968, bound for service with the 6th Fleet. The submarine carried its documented restrictions, deferred work, advanced weapons, and 99 men into an operation expected to demonstrate that it remained capable of performing the mission for which it had been built. Carrying unfinished work and unresolved doubts with it, the submarine entered the Mediterranean as though the most dangerous part of its story still lay safely ahead: the Mediterranean deployment. That hidden assignment began as part of an overseas voyage that appeared ordinary enough to conceal how little of Scorpion's route remained predictable. The submarine had crossed the Atlantic before, operated with Allied forces and spent long periods beyond public observation, so nothing about another Mediterranean deployment immediately suggested that this journey would be remembered differently. For the crew, it meant returning to a familiar cycle of submerged watches, exercises, maintenance, and brief appearances in foreign ports. For the Navy, it placed one more nuclear attack submarine where its speed and secrecy could support the 6th Fleet. Only in retrospect would the routine nature of those first weeks become unsettling, because each completed movement seemed to carry the boat safely past the concerns left behind in Norfolk. Assigned to the overseas commitment, Scorpion departed Norfolk on February 15, 1968, beginning a deployment that would keep it away from home for more than 3 months. Its route first carried it across the western Atlantic toward Rota, Spain, where it remained from March 1st through March 5 before passing through the Strait of Gibraltar. The official record then placed the submarine at Taranto, Italy, on March 10th, confirming that it had reached the Mediterranean and entered the operating world of the 6th Fleet. Nothing in that sequence appeared exceptional. It was the movement of a commissioned warship following orders through ports and waters already familiar to American naval forces past the Strait of Gibraltar. The Atlantic narrowed into a confined naval arena crowded with Allied forces, Soviet activity, commercial traffic, and closely watched coastlines. The Mediterranean offered less empty water than the open ocean, yet its depth, shipping noise, and complex geography still provided countless places for a submarine to remain concealed. American carrier groups, destroyers, patrol aircraft, and submarines operated there alongside NATO partners, while Soviet naval units maintained their own presence across the region. Beneath the surface, movements that appeared distant on a chart could become closely connected through sonar, intelligence reports, and orders passed between commands. Little of the deployment entered the public record, because the movements of a nuclear attack submarine were rarely described beyond scattered dates, exercises, and port calls. Surface ships could be photographed entering harbours or reported sailing with visible formations, but much of an attack submarine's work depended on withholding its position. Even during exercises, the value of the boat came partly from making other forces search for it under conditions resembling a real encounter. The resulting silence in the historical record does not necessarily indicate that something unusual occurred. It reflects the ordinary secrecy surrounding vessels whose usefulness depended upon disappearing for long intervals. During fleet exercises, Scorpion alternated between hunter and target, testing whether surface ships, aircraft, and other submarines could find a vessel built to avoid them. The crew might be directed to penetrate a defended area, evade tracking forces, simulate an attack, or locate another participant moving beneath the same water. These exercises transformed the Mediterranean into a controlled version of the conflict both sides were preparing to fight, with sonar contacts and calculated approaches replacing the visible lines of conventional battle. The Naval History and Heritage Command later described Scorpion as having played an important role in developing nuclear submarine warfare tactics through repeated testing and exercises during its service. Simulated encounters carried a serious purpose, rehearsing the tracking, evasion, and attack decisions that would become real if Cold War surveillance ever turned into combat. Every contact had to be classified, followed, and interpreted without allowing training to become collision or misunderstanding. A submarine commander needed to know when to close distance, when to preserve separation, and when an apparently favourable position carried more risk than value. The men inside Scorpion therefore practiced uncertainty as much as procedure, operating against opponents they could hear but rarely see, while knowing that similar methods were being used by Soviet crews elsewhere in the same region. Near Spain's southern coast, Rota provided a brief point of contact between the concealed operations at sea and the visible naval world ashore. Its location near the entrance to the Mediterranean made it an important threshold for American naval movements, especially for submarines travelling between European waters and the Atlantic. Yet a port call did not end the deployment's isolation. It provided fuel, supplies, repairs, messages, and temporary contact with land before the crew returned below decks, and the submarine moved once more beyond ordinary observation. Naples offered a different interruption, replacing machinery, artificial light, and enclosed compartments with a harbour surrounded by a densely inhabited coastline. On April 10th, Scorpion came alongside USS Tallahatchie County outside Claywall Harbour, where a series of Navy photographs captured the submarine at the surface. Commander Francis Slattery could be seen atop the sail as the boat approached, and the images showed sailors standing on a vessel that still appeared completely intact. Those photographs are believed to be among the final known images of Scorpion before its disappearance, although nothing visible within them suggests that the submarine was approaching its last weeks. Each return aboard reversed the temporary contact with land, closing the men once again inside the vessel as it slipped away from public sight. Harbour noise faded, daylight disappeared, and the submarine resumed the controlled routines that had carried it through earlier operations. The shift from pier to deep water could happen repeatedly during a deployment, becoming too familiar to feel like a dividing line. Men who had walked ashore only hours earlier returned to watches, machinery, and narrow compartments without knowing which departure from land would be their last. Judged only by what had been completed, the deployment seemed to confirm that Scorpion could still cross oceans, enter foreign ports, join fleet operations, and perform the work expected of it. The known maintenance concerns carried from Norfolk had not produced a publicly recorded emergency serious enough to terminate the assignment. Weeks at sea became evidence of continued function, and every completed exercise appeared to support the decision to send the submarine abroad. Yet successful operation could reveal only that its systems had worked until then, not what strains had accumulated or what might occur during the next passage. Westward movement gradually changed the meaning of every mile, turning the route from another operational passage into the beginning of the journey home. By May, the 6th Fleet portion of the assignment was ending, and Scorpion left the Mediterranean for the Atlantic. The submarine had completed what official naval history later described as a successful deployment and was returning to the United States, carrying the same crew routines and hidden technical history into a crossing that should have ended at Norfolk. A direct crossing should have followed, governed by navigation, scheduled communications, and an arrival time that could eventually be passed to those waiting ashore. Once beyond Gibraltar, the boat no longer appeared to be moving deeper into an assignment. Its direction pointed toward home, and the Atlantic ahead represented the final distance separating the crew from the lives they had left in February. Nothing required the return to be dramatic. For a submarine designed to cross unseen, the safest ending would have been the least remarkable one: a quiet passage west followed by a scheduled appearance near Virginia. Before the Atlantic could become only a road home, new instructions redirected the submarine's attention towards Soviet naval activity beyond the Mediterranean. Scorpion remained an operational fast attack submarine, and the journey back to Norfolk did not remove it from the Navy's need for intelligence. Somewhere ahead was a Soviet formation whose movements had become important enough for the returning boat to investigate, transforming the remaining voyage from a passage home into one final concealed approach. Home now lay to the west, but one last intelligence assignment drew Scorpion towards ships it had been trained to approach without being seen, orders to watch the Soviet fleet. What changed next was almost invisible outside the naval chain of command, yet it transformed the final crossing from a routine return into another concealed operation. No alarm sounded through the compartments, and nothing visible on the surface announced that USS Scorpion was no longer following the simplest path toward Norfolk. A new set of instructions was enough to place the submarine's homecoming behind the immediate needs of Cold War intelligence. Somewhere ahead, Soviet vessels were operating in the eastern Atlantic, and the American boat was ordered to move toward them before turning fully west. For the families already expecting the deployment to be almost over, that change remained unknown. Through operational channels came an instruction that placed intelligence gathering ahead of the most direct route to Virginia. Although Scorpion had completed its Mediterranean assignment, it remained an active fast attack submarine under naval command, still capable of being diverted wherever its presence might reveal something important. The return voyage was not leave, nor was it a protected corridor through which no further demands could reach the crew. Until the submarine entered Norfolk, its speed, sonar, and ability to remain hidden could still be used, and the Soviet activity reported near the Canary Islands created a final reason to delay the uncomplicated journey home. Later naval accounts identify the surveillance of Soviet operations in that region as Scorpion's last mission. Off northwest Africa, the waters around the Canary Islands formed a broad crossroads for ships moving between Europe, the African coast, the Mediterranean approaches, and the open Atlantic. The islands rose visibly above major sea routes, but the surrounding underwater space offered none of the fixed boundaries suggested by land. Deep water extended beyond the shelves around them, commercial traffic added layers of machinery noise, and naval vessels could approach from several directions without forming a clearly defined front. It was the kind of region where the presence of a Soviet group could be known in general terms while its exact movement still required a closer observer. Somewhere within that region operated a collection of Soviet vessels whose precise composition and purpose were described differently in later accounts. Published versions commonly identify a nuclear-powered submarine accompanied by surface vessels, including support or intelligence-related ships, but the surviving public record does not provide one complete and uncontested formation. What mattered to American command was that the group represented more than ordinary merchant traffic. Its movements, organization, and acoustic behavior could reveal how the Soviet Navy operated beyond its home waters, especially when a submarine was involved. Chief among the reported vessels was an Echo II class nuclear submarine, a type developed to carry cruise missiles against major naval targets. The class reflected a Soviet strategy in which submarines could threaten carrier groups and other important formations from beyond the range of conventional torpedo attacks. Locating such a vessel was therefore not simply a matter of marking another hull on a chart. Its route, speed, escort pattern, machinery sounds, and methods of communication could all contribute to the larger intelligence picture through which the United States attempted to understand Soviet capabilities before those capabilities were ever used in war. Close observation promised information that distant reports could not provide, including the relationship between the submarine and the ships moving with it. From a sufficiently useful position, Scorpion might determine whether the force maintained a deliberate formation, whether the submarine operated independently, or whether the surface vessels appeared to be supporting a specific activity. Acoustic signatures could help American analysts recognize the same units during future encounters, while changes in course and speed might suggest how the group responded to exercises, communications, or suspected surveillance. The mission demanded patience because the most valuable details were often revealed not by one dramatic movement, but by patterns repeated over time. On sonar, the formation would have emerged not as a visible fleet, but as overlapping sounds that had to be separated, classified, and followed. Propellers, pumps, turbines, and other machinery could travel through the water from different bearings, distorted by distance, temperature layers, sea conditions, and the movement of Scorpion itself. Commercial vessels passing through the wider region could add unrelated contacts, forcing operators to distinguish a Soviet warship from traffic with no connection to the assignment. A formation that appeared orderly from the air could become an uncertain collection of acoustic traces beneath the surface, each one requiring interpretation before the submarine could move closer. Every reduction in distance improved the chance of gathering useful intelligence while increasing the risk that the American submarine might reveal itself. Closing on the Soviet group required Scorpion to estimate where the vessels were heading and place itself where their sounds could be followed without allowing its own machinery or movement through the water to become too obvious. Greater speed could help regain contact but might produce more noise. Slower movement could preserve concealment while allowing the target to open the distance. The mission therefore depended on maintaining a position close enough to observe, yet distant and quiet enough to remain only a possibility in the minds of the Soviet crews. No surviving public evidence proves that those crews detected Scorpion, pursued it, or understood how near the hidden observer had come. Later theories would portray the mission as a confrontation, sometimes suggesting that Soviet forces attacked the American submarine after discovering it nearby. The known assignment establishes that Scorpion was directed towards Soviet activity, but it does not establish combat. Official naval history continues to describe the submarine's loss as an accident of undetermined cause, while acknowledging that Soviet attack became one of many theories proposed afterward. Between the two navies lay an unwitnessed stretch of ocean where movements could occur without leaving a public record. No neutral vessel followed beneath the surface, and no continuous account from Scorpion survived to show every turn, depth change, or contact report. Commands ashore could know the assignment they had issued and receive whatever the submarine managed to transmit, but the intervals between those communications belonged entirely to the vessels at sea. Even successful surveillance could leave little evidence beyond a brief report stating that contact had been made or that a group had been observed. Later speculation transformed the Soviet presence into something more ominous, because it provided a human adversary near the final stage of the voyage. Mechanical failure could be uncertain and impersonal, while the image of two rival submarines moving through the same water offered a clearer, more dramatic explanation. Yet the existence of an opponent did not prove that the opponent caused the disaster. Soviet and American submarines routinely attempted to locate or follow one another during the Cold War, and much of that dangerous activity ended without weapons being fired. The mystery surrounding Scorpion would eventually draw the Canary Islands mission into theories far larger than the evidence available to support them. One of the last surviving operational reports indicated that the submarine intended to observe the Soviet submarine and the vessels associated with it. The language preserved in later accounts suggests the beginning or continuation of surveillance rather than an emergency. There was no reported collision, no warning that Scorpion had been attacked, and no message describing an uncontrollable casualty while near the group. At that point in the record, the boat was still carrying out the kind of intelligence work for which it had been built, moving toward a contact while attempting to preserve the advantage of remaining unseen. Past that reported intention, the documentary trail thins precisely where a complete account would matter most. No publicly available log reconstructs the mission minute by minute, and no surviving testimony can explain how close Scorpion came, how long it remained, or what its crew learned. The absence of detail does not prove that the encounter became hostile. It reflects the secrecy of submarine operations and the loss of everyone who could have described what occurred aboard. What may have been an ordinary intelligence task became mysterious because the vessel performing it never returned to place the experience into context. Eventually, the surveillance appears to have ended, allowing Scorpion to turn west once more toward the route to Virginia. Later summaries described the submarine as having completed the mission before it was lost on May 22, 1968, during the return from its successful Mediterranean deployment. That sequence placed the Soviet group behind it rather than directly beside it at the established time of the sinking, though uncertainty over the boat's exact movements continued to feed later suspicion. Whatever had been learned near the Soviet force still had to cross the Atlantic through communications links that were already proving unreliable. Intelligence held inside a submerged submarine could not influence commanders until it reached a receiving station, and Scorpion was operating thousands of miles from Norfolk with transmissions affected by distance, atmospheric conditions, equipment, and the limitations imposed by underwater operations. The secret approach may have been over, but the record of it had not yet safely reached those waiting on land. Its next words reached shore only in fragments, forcing distant stations to reconstruct a message from a submarine they could barely hear. The messages that barely reached shore. Once the transmission left the submarine, its words entered a communications network where strength, clarity, and even meaning could change before reaching shore. The men aboard USS Scorpion could prepare a report carefully, verify its routing, and send it through the equipment available to them, yet they could not control what happened after the signal crossed the horizon. Distance weakened it, atmospheric conditions altered its path, and receiving stations might capture only part of what had been transmitted. In the final days of the voyage, the submarine's location and intentions depended upon this uncertain passage between a concealed vessel and operators listening thousands of miles away. Seawater itself stood between Scorpion and the stations attempting to hear it, absorbing the frequencies through which ships on the surface communicated more easily. A submarine could receive certain low-frequency transmissions while remaining submerged, but sending detailed traffic generally required it to approach the surface and raise an antenna or mast into a position where radio signals could escape. That movement did not necessarily expose the entire boat, yet it reduced the protection offered by depth and forced the crew to balance communication against concealment. The submarine had been created to disappear beneath the ocean, while every attempt to speak required it to re-establish a temporary connection with the world above. Operational secrecy imposed another barrier, because every unnecessary transmission risked announcing the submarine's presence to forces capable of listening. Radio direction finding systems could sometimes use a signal to estimate where it originated, and intelligence services monitored naval frequencies for patterns that might reveal movements or intentions. For this reason, Scorpion was reportedly operating under instructions to maintain electronic silence, except when communication became necessary. A long interval without a message could therefore indicate discipline rather than distress, making the difference between normal concealment and sudden disaster almost impossible to recognize from shore. Congressional discussion of the loss later stated that the submarine transmitted only one message after leaving rotor under those restrictions. Before a report could leave the boat, several conditions had to align inside a vessel, still attempting to remain concealed. The message had to be prepared in the proper naval format, its information checked, and its routing determined before transmission began. The submarine then had to reach a depth and posture compatible with the equipment being used, while the crew remained alert to contacts that might make transmitting unsafe. Radio communication was therefore not a continuous conversation between commander and headquarters. It was a brief operational event, conducted when circumstances permitted and ended as soon as the necessary information had been sent. Far beyond the submarine, a scattered system of receiving sites waited for signals that could arrive faintly, indirectly, or through a station never intended as their final destination. Naval communications depended on powerful shore transmitters, distant antenna fields, relay facilities, and operators trained to recognize traffic hidden within interference. Some stations were designed to send low-frequency messages across oceans to submerged boats, requiring enormous antennas and high power because only a narrow stream of information could penetrate beneath the surface. The scale of those installations reveal the difficulty of reaching a submarine that might be moving silently through thousands of square miles of water. A message heard in one country might still have several stages to cross before reaching the officers responsible for Scorpion's movements. A receiving station could copy the transmission, place it into a shore communication circuit, and relay it toward the appropriate Atlantic command. The operator who first detected the signal might know little about the submarine's mission, while those who understood its importance could be located far from the antenna that had captured it. Each step preserved the message while also separating it further from the men who had originally prepared it. Between antenna and receiver lay an atmosphere that could bend a transmission across enormous distances or break it into something barely recognizable. Long-range radio propagation depended on frequency, time of day, atmospheric layers, solar conditions, and the location of both sender and receiver. A signal could travel far beyond the visible horizon by reflecting through the upper atmosphere. Yet the same process could create fading, interference, or sudden changes in strength. Static from weather and overlapping transmissions could obscure individual characters, leaving operators to distinguish deliberate groups from noise that had crossed the receiver at the same moment. Nothing reached shore in the intimate form of a human voice explaining what the crew had seen or how the voyage was progressing. Naval traffic was compressed into formal messages containing call signs, routing indicators, time groups, coordinates, courses, expected arrivals, and carefully chosen operational language. Encryption protected sensitive information, but also prevented an operator from interpreting unclear portions through ordinary context. The receiver could not simply guess what Commander Francis Slattery probably meant. The message had to be copied accurately enough to survive decoding and reach those authorized to read it. Every group of characters carried weight, since one incorrectly copied figure could move the submarine across miles of ocean on the receiving chart. Latitude and longitude reduced a vessel's position to numbers whose accuracy depended on each digit being transmitted, heard, written, and relayed correctly. A mistaken time could alter how far the boat should have travelled after reporting. An uncertain course could send later searchers in the wrong direction. Under normal conditions, such information supported routine command and navigation. After a disappearance, the same groups became the boundaries of the last-moment investigators could place with confidence. Signals from Scorpion did not always reach the network with the strength needed for a report that might later have to be reconstructed precisely. Distance alone could leave the transmission faint, while the submarine's antenna position, radio equipment, atmospheric conditions, and frequency choice could further affect reception. A station might hear enough to identify the sender, but not enough to copy every group cleanly. Another station farther away might receive a different portion with greater clarity. What began aboard as one complete message could therefore appear ashore as several imperfect versions requiring comparison. Successful transmission aboard the submarine did not necessarily mean successful understanding ashore. The radio man could send the complete report and receive indications that the equipment had operated normally, yet still have no immediate certainty that the intended command had copied every word. An acknowledgement might arrive later through another circuit, or not arrive at all while the submarine returned beneath the surface. Repeating the message could improve the chance of reception, but it also required additional time near communications depth and produced another signal that could potentially be detected. Silence after transmission could consequently mean that the exchange was complete, that the acknowledgement had failed, or that the submarine had already resumed covert movement. After the boat vanished, communications paperwork became a substitute for witnesses who could no longer explain what they had attempted to send. Investigators examined station logs, copied messages, routing records, transmission times, and reports from operators who had been on duty. These documents could establish that a signal had been heard and show what shore personnel believed it contained, but they could not recover words that interference had erased. Nor could they reveal whether the crew had attempted another transmission that no station successfully received. Conflicting accounts entered the story wherever incomplete reception left room for later interpretation. Some later descriptions attributed additional messages, unusual phrases, or weak signals to Scorpion, while official reconstructions treated only a narrower group of communications as confirmed. A call sign heard through static could be copied incorrectly or confused with other naval traffic. A signal received after the disappearance could seem meaningful because searchers desperately hoped the submarine was still transmitting. Without clear authentication and a reliable record, however, an apparent contact could not safely be treated as proof that the crew remained alive. At best, each report fixed the submarine to a single moment, while the water beyond that moment remained unwritten. A position showed where Scorpion had calculated itself to be when the message was prepared, not where it travelled afterward. An estimated arrival reflected the commander's intentions under the conditions then known, not a guarantee that the route would remain unchanged. Even a completely accurate transmission could illuminate only one point along an Atlantic crossing, extending across several days. Among the weak signals and uncertain routing, one report would eventually stand apart because investigators could place it firmly within the surviving record. It carried the submarine's position, its projected movement, and the arrival estimate by which Norfolk continued preparing for its return. Congressional records later identified it as the only message Scorpion sent after leaving Rota while operating under orders to preserve electronic silence. The communication contained no declared emergency and gave those ashore no reason to believe the submarine was approaching the final hours from which no further confirmed report would emerge. That transmission fixed Scorpion briefly in time and space, then became the final confirmed line between the submarine and the world waiting ahead of it. The last confirmed transmission. For one brief moment, the submarine emerged from uncertainty clearly enough to leave behind a time, a position, and an expectation of reaching home. The message contained none of the urgency later generations would search for within it, because those who received it had no reason to treat the transmission as the final confirmed contact with USS Scorpion. It appeared to be another operational report from a boat crossing the Atlantic after an overseas deployment, the kind of communication that placed a submarine on a chart and allowed shore commands to anticipate its next movement. Only after every later message failed to arrive would the ordinary details preserved in that report acquire the weight of a final statement. Late on May 23rd, Scorpion renewed contact with shore after operating under the electronic silence expected of a submarine returning from an intelligence mission. One later congressional account placed the transmission at approximately 7:54 in the evening by Norfolk time, although surviving summaries do not always reproduce the same timing and wording. The message came after the boat had completed its work near Soviet naval activity and resumed the westward passage toward Virginia. At that point, the submarine was still following a recognizable sequence: report its location, confirm its movement, provide an estimated arrival, then disappear again beneath the communication silence that protected its route. Near the surface, the boat briefly surrendered part of its concealment so that its report could escape the Atlantic. A transmitting antenna had to reach a position from which the signal could travel through the air rather than die within the seawater surrounding the hull. The submarine did not need to surface completely, but the act of communicating required a temporary change from the deeper, quieter conditions in which it was hardest to detect. Somewhere inside the radio spaces, the prepared groups were sent outward, while the rest of the vessel remained sealed beneath the sea, carrying 99 men whose presence ashore was represented only by the signal leaving the mast. Thousands of miles from Norfolk, a naval station in Greece became the point through which the hidden submarine reappeared to American command. The path seems geographically strange at first, because Scorpion was west of Europe and travelling toward the United States, yet naval communications did not always move along the most direct line between sender and destination. A station capable of hearing the weak transmission could receive it, copy the traffic, and pass it onward through military channels. The submarine therefore reached Norfolk indirectly, not through a voice speaking to the pier that awaited it, but through coded information handled by operators far from both the boat and its destination. Coordinates should have been the most reliable part of the report, yet even Scorpion's final stated position survives in more than one published version. Official and later historical accounts have described the submarine as being south or southwest of the Azores, but they do not always agree on the reported distance from the islands. Some place it roughly 50 miles south, while another widely cited account describes a position approximately 250 miles southwest. The difference is too large to ignore, and it illustrates how even a message accepted as genuine can become less precise as copies, summaries, and later interpretations accumulate around it. The Azores placed the submarine within a recognizable part of the Atlantic, but they did little to narrow the enormous space still surrounding it. The Portuguese island group lay far west of continental Europe, separated from Virginia by thousands of miles of open water. Once Scorpion departed that region, its possible position would expand with every hour according to its speed, course, depth, and any adjustments made by Commander Francis Slattery. A point on the chart could be marked with confidence, yet the ocean beyond it remained wide enough to conceal countless variations of the route home. More reassuring than the coordinates was the arrival estimate, which projected the boat toward a specific berth and a waiting crowd. Scorpion expected to reach Norfolk at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on May 27th, a time that later appeared in the public announcement telling families when to gather. The estimate implied that the submarine's crew believed the remaining crossing could be completed normally. It suggested sufficient propulsion, navigation, supplies, and operational control to continue toward Virginia, according to a predictable schedule. Nothing in that expected arrival indicated that the boat was already trapped in a worsening emergency. Its timing suggested that the Soviet operation had already been left behind, and that the remaining voyage was again directed west. The final report is often linked to the earlier surveillance assignment because it followed the period in which Scorpion had been diverted towards Soviet vessels near the Canary Islands. Yet the surviving communication does not describe a battle, a pursuit, or an unresolved confrontation continuing around the submarine. Instead, it appears within the record of a boat returning from that work, placing distance between itself and the force it had been ordered to observe. That distinction would matter later, when theories of hostile Soviet action attempted to fill the silence after contact ended. Missing from the report was any indication that the crew believed the submarine had entered immediate danger. No authenticated distress call announced flooding, fire, collision, propulsion failure, weapon trouble, or hostile attack. There was no request for assistance and no warning that Scorpion might fail to meet the arrival time it had provided. The absence of such language cannot prove that every system aboard was operating perfectly, because the message may not have been intended as a complete report of the boat's condition. It does show that the last confirmed communication did not present the voyage as an emergency. To those receiving it, the transmission described continuity rather than crisis, placing Scorpion where a homeward-bound submarine could reasonably be. The boat had completed its Mediterranean deployment, carried out an additional intelligence task, and now reported an expected arrival in Norfolk. Electronic silence after that exchange was consistent with the habits of a vessel designed to avoid unnecessary transmissions. Shore commands therefore possessed no clear reason to interpret the end of the message as the beginning of a disaster. The submarine had spoken, given its intentions, and returned to the concealed movement expected of it. A single plotted position could not become a continuous track unless another report arrived to extend it. After the antenna was lowered, no shore station could see whether Scorpion maintained the projected course, altered speed, changed depth, or turned in response to weather, traffic, equipment, or new orders. Search planners would later calculate likely routes from the last accepted location, but those routes remained estimates built from what the submarine was expected to do. The actual movement of the boat existed only within the instruments, charts, and decisions of the men aboard. Less than a day later, the submarine would be lost somewhere southwest of the Azores, yet no confirmed transmission marked the moment ordinary passage became catastrophe. The Navy eventually accepted May 20th as the date of the sinking, but the exact time and initiating event remained uncertain. Between the final message and the destructive sounds later identified in underwater acoustic records lay a blank interval in which Scorpion continued moving without leaving another authenticated report. Whatever began during those hours either developed too quickly for a warning, prevented the crew from transmitting, or occurred while the submarine was too deep to send one. During the first hours without another signal, the quiet still resembled the disciplined absence expected from a submarine crossing. Unseen. No alarm spread through Norfolk, because the boat had not yet missed its scheduled arrival and had not been ordered to maintain constant contact. The final report remained one entry among many operational records rather than the boundary between known movement and unexplained loss. As May 27th passed and the days continued, the submarine's silence did not immediately become evidence of death. It remained an accepted part of underwater service until the empty distance began to last longer than procedure could explain. The message ended without urgency, and the silence that followed remained ordinary long enough for the disaster to pass unnoticed. Several days of unnoticed silence. By then, no precise moment had separated disciplined quiet from the first evidence that the submarine was no longer moving toward home. After the final confirmed transmission, USS Scorpion disappeared again into the pattern expected of a nuclear attack submarine crossing the Atlantic. Submerged, largely silent, and beyond direct observation, the absence of another message did not immediately announce disaster, because silence was one of the conditions under which the boat had been designed to operate. Somewhere between the last position report and the scheduled arrival at Norfolk, that ordinary absence became permanent, yet no one ashore could see when the change occurred. Unlike an aircraft observed across radar screens, the boat left no continuous track for commanders to watch as it crossed the ocean. Its position existed only at the moments when the crew reported it, after which naval planners could project a likely route using estimated speed, intended course, and the arrival time provided by Commander Francis Slattery. On charts, the submarine could be advanced westward hour by hour, but every new mark represented an assumption rather than any other confirmed sighting. No coastal radar followed it across the open Atlantic, and no escorting ship maintained visual contact with the hull hidden beneath the water. Concealment depended partly upon resisting the very contact that might have reassured those waiting on land. A submarine that transmitted too frequently risked revealing information about its position, route, or activity to foreign monitoring stations. Electronic silence was therefore not an absence that naval commanders automatically feared. It was a form of protection, allowing the vessel to cross large areas without generating a radio pattern that an adversary might study. The discipline that made Scorpion difficult for Soviet forces to locate also made it difficult for American officers to know whether the crossing was still proceeding normally. No daily message was required to prove that 99 men were still alive beneath the Atlantic. The boat was not expected to rise at a fixed hour, merely to confirm that its machinery remained functional and its crew safe. Such a requirement would have weakened the secrecy central to submarine operations and forced the vessel into predictable communications routines. Unless orders required a report, new information had to be sent, or an emergency made silence impossible, the crew could continue west without speaking. For those ashore, several quiet hours could become a quiet day without violating the logic of the mission. On plotting tables, the submarine continued westward long after the real vessel had stopped leaving any recoverable trace. Officers could calculate where Scorpion should be if it maintained a reasonable speed toward Norfolk, extending its projected course across the ocean as though the boat still occupied each successive point. That paper movement carried an appearance of order because it followed the intentions contained in the final transmission. Yet a plotted route could not detect whether the submarine had turned, slowed, descended, or suffered a casualty that ended all movement within minutes. May 22nd passed without a public emergency, although it would later become the date assigned to the destruction of the boat. At the time, the submarine was still 5 days from its announced arrival, leaving a wide interval in which communication silence could remain consistent with normal procedure. Families had no reason to believe that the men they expected on May 27 might already have been lost. The Navy had not released a warning, the submarine had not missed its berth, and no visible event connected the calm Atlantic surface with a disaster unfolding far below it. Nothing reached the surface to separate catastrophe from an uneventful crossing. No authenticated distress call announced that Scorpion was flooding, burning, losing propulsion, or sinking beyond recovery. No emergency buoy appeared carrying a recorded position or message. No merchant vessel reported debris, oil, survivors, or an explosion. The ocean produced no immediate evidence that would have forced Naval Command to abandon its projected track and replace it with a search area. Inside restricted command channels, unanswered traffic began to acquire a meaning the waiting families had not yet been given. Later accounts indicate that concern existed before the formal missing submarine declaration, with Atlantic Command attempting to establish whether Scorpion was still receiving or responding to classified communications. A message sent toward the submarine could go unanswered for several reasons, and the first failure to reply did not prove that the boat had been destroyed. Repeated failures, however, weakened the assumption that the silence remained entirely voluntary. Suspicion alone could not reveal whether the submarine was disabled, diverted, unable to transmit, or already beyond rescue. A communications casualty might prevent the crew from answering while leaving the boat capable of continuing home. New orders could have altered its route without every office immediately receiving confirmation. Atmospheric conditions might interfere with traffic, or the submarine might remain too deep to communicate during a period when operational circumstances made surfacing undesirable. Each explanation preserved the possibility that Scorpion still existed somewhere ahead of its last report. Behind the official expectation of an arrival, officers began testing every explanation that might account for the missing replies. Communications records could be reviewed to determine whether a weak or misrouted signal had been overlooked. Other commands could be asked whether the submarine had contacted them. Traffic intended for Scorpion could be repeated through different stations or frequencies. These early efforts were not yet the vast search that would later spread across the Atlantic. They were attempts to decide whether an emergency existed at all. Outside those secure rooms, the calendar still pointed toward a homecoming rather than a disaster. The expected arrival remained Monday, May 27th, and relatives prepared according to the schedule that had been publicly announced. Nothing in the silence visible to them suggested that the deployment had already ended somewhere beneath the ocean. The submarine was simply absent in the same way it had been absent throughout much of the voyage, enclosed below the surface and beyond the reach of ordinary contact. Only the scheduled arrival created a boundary the submarine could not cross invisibly. Before that hour, every unanswered message could be balanced against the possibility that Scorpion remained operational but silent. Once the boat was due at Norfolk, however, concealment no longer explained its absence. An arriving submarine had to communicate with harbour authorities, coordinate movement near the coast, prepare for assistance, and appear in the channel leading toward its berth. The conditions that had allowed silence to seem normal across the Atlantic no longer applied within sight of home. At Norfolk, the ocean finally had to produce the vessel that charts and estimates had been carrying west for days. Families gathered near the pier while naval personnel watched the approaches, expecting the dark hull to surface and enter the harbour, according to the reported schedule. The appointed hour passed without a signal, a periscope, or the low outline of Scorpion moving toward its berth. For the first time, the disappearance no longer existed only within radio logs, projected courses, and restricted concern. It occupied a physical space where a submarine should have been. When the appointed hour arrived and no submarine entered the harbour, the silence at last took the visible shape of an empty berth. A search across the Atlantic. Only after the harbour remained empty did the Navy confront the difference between knowing a submarine had failed to arrive and knowing where it had disappeared. USS Scorpion was no longer merely overdue, yet the absence visible at Norfolk offered no direction toward the Atlantic waters where the search should begin. The boat's last confirmed position lay thousands of miles away. Its intended course crossed an immense region without fixed boundaries, and no distress call had identified the point where the voyage ended. Declaring an emergency could mobilise ships, aircraft and communication stations, but it could not recover the missing piece every search required, a reliable final location. At approximately 3 o'clock on the afternoon of May 27th, the Navy declared event submiss, formally identifying Scorpion as a missing submarine. The designation transformed the unanswered communications and missed arrivals into an organised naval crisis, setting procedures into motion across commands that had previously been dealing with uncertainty in separate offices. It did not mean the crew had been declared dead, nor did it prove that the submarine had sunk. It meant that the Navy could no longer account for one of its nuclear attack submarines, and had to proceed as though the 99 men aboard might still be waiting for help somewhere beyond Norfolk. Repeated calls crossed the Atlantic toward a vessel whose radio room could no longer confirm that anything was being received. Naval stations transmitted messages through available circuits and frequencies, attempting to reach Scorpion directly or produce any sign that its communications equipment still functioned. The submarine was called by systems designed to reach vessels operating far from land, but every transmission ended with the same absence of acknowledgement. A communications failure could still explain the silence, yet each unsuccessful attempt reduced the number of ordinary explanations remaining. Before the ocean could be treated as a search field, officers had to eliminate the possibility that the submarine had reappeared somewhere else within the naval system. Commands and communication centres were checked for overlooked or delayed traffic. Ports along possible routes could be asked whether the boat had arrived unexpectedly or made contact under circumstances not yet reported to Norfolk. Operational channels had to determine whether altered instructions might have taken Scorpion away from its announced schedule. The search therefore began partly through paperwork and radio logs, removing one possible explanation at a time while the physical vessel remained beyond sight. Uncertainty began with the starting point itself, because the last report marked where the submarine had been rather than where its journey had ended. Even published accounts later differed over the precise distance between Scorpion and the Azores when its final communication was sent. From that position, the boat could have travelled hundreds of miles before suffering trouble, especially if it maintained the speed expected of a nuclear attack submarine returning home. The last message offered a point from which to calculate, but not a place where wreckage, survivors, or an emergency buoy could reasonably be expected. From that imperfect position, planners drew probable courses toward Virginia through water that offered no fixed road for the boat to follow. The expected arrival at Norfolk provided an estimate of the speed needed to complete the crossing, while the known destination suggested a general westward track. Yet a submarine did not have to follow a single visible lane across the ocean. Commander Francis Slattery could alter course for navigation, weather, traffic, operational requirements, or reasons never communicated ashore. Every projected line represented what Scorpion was likely to have done, not what anyone had observed it doing. Each unrecorded hour widened the geometry of the search, turning one missing point into an expanding region of possible movement. A boat travelling steadily could cover a great distance after its last report, while one disabled soon afterward might remain much closer to the Azores. A submarine suffering partial propulsion trouble could drift or move at reduced speed along a route different from the one planners expected. If it had surfaced, winds and currents might influence its position. If it had sunk, the wreck could lie beneath water far removed from any evidence remaining above. The search area grew not only because time had passed, but because every plausible condition produced a different location. Above the Atlantic, aircraft began scanning for evidence small enough to disappear between waves and large enough to explain the loss of 99 men. The effort involved Navy forces and support from the Coast Guard and Air Force, extending observation across likely portions of the route. Aircrews looked for an unexpectedly surfaced submarine, oil, floating debris, emergency markers, flares, rafts, or survivors. From altitude, however, even a large vessel could become difficult to distinguish in poor visibility or rough water, while scattered wreckage might resemble ordinary refuse until examined closely. Surface vessels changed course toward positions that might already have been days removed from the event they were trying to find. Ships could search more carefully than aircraft, investigate reported objects, listen for underwater signals, and remain in an area after darkness ended aerial observation. The submarine rescue vessel USS Sunbird, operating near Narragansett Bay when the alert arrived, was ordered south to assist, joining a response that spread beyond the forces already near Norfolk. Yet every ship faced the same limitation. It had to cross a real distance before beginning work in waters chosen largely through calculation. Hope complicated every decision, because searchers could not yet assume that the crew was beyond assistance. Scorpion might have surfaced and been unable to communicate, drifting with mechanical trouble while conserving power and supplies. It might have remained submerged with limited propulsion or damaged radio equipment. Search planners also had to consider the possibility that the boat had reached the seabed intact, enough for men inside to survive temporarily. Each possibility demanded urgency, but each required different evidence and could place the submarine in a different part of the Atlantic. Depth imposed another uncertainty beneath the search area, dividing locations where rescue might still be imagined from those where it would be impossible. Submarine rescue systems depended on knowing the exact position of a disabled boat and reaching it before conditions inside became fatal. They also depended on the submarine resting within an accessible depth. Much of the open Atlantic along the probable route descended thousands of feet, far beyond any realistic rescue operation available in 1968. Finding the boat would therefore not necessarily mean reaching the crew, and every hour spent searching reduced the likelihood that a survivable emergency could remain survivable. Across the widening search zones, the sea withheld the ordinary traces by which a lost vessel might reveal its final position. No confirmed debris field appeared along the projected route. No oil slick was identified where a hull had broken open. No emergency marker rose carrying coordinates from the deep. The absence of wreckage preserved hope because it did not prove destruction, yet it also deprived searchers of the first physical clue needed to concentrate their effort. An entire nuclear submarine had vanished without leaving anything immediately visible on the surface. As the operation continued without discovery, cautious public language began moving from an overdue submarine toward the possibility that no rescue would occur. Families who had waited at Norfolk now watched a search whose scale revealed how little the Navy knew. Newspapers could report the number of aircraft, ships, and miles being examined, but none of those figures brought the submarine closer to being found. The open ocean effort continued for 8 days after the formal alert, ending on June 4th with the announcement that Scorpion and its crew were presumed lost. By the time the search had spread across the Atlantic, its clearest result was the scale of the uncertainty confronting it. Ships and aircraft had crossed likely routes, communication stations had continued calling, and officers had plotted movements from the last known position toward Norfolk. Yet no evidence showed where the submarine had stopped. The response was enormous, but it remained directed toward possibilities rather than a confirmed site. Then, among the unanswered traffic surrounding the operation, one reported transmission appeared to offer something the ocean had refused to provide. It seemed to contain a familiar identifier associated with the missing submarine, and for searchers who had heard nothing but silence, even an uncertain signal could suggest that the crew had survived long enough to call again. For a brief moment, a transmission no one could fully explain made it seem possible that Scorpion was still somewhere beneath the searchers, attempting to be heard. The signal that raised false hope. Amid that fragile possibility, a few indistinct radio groups seemed to carry something no searcher expected to hear again from the missing boat. For 2 days, ships, aircraft and communication stations had searched an Atlantic that offered no confirmed wreckage, no emergency marker, and no authenticated call from the 99 men aboard USS Scorpion. Then the silence appeared to break. The transmission was brief, weak, and incomplete, but one word within it seemed familiar enough to alter the atmosphere of the search. If it had truly come from the submarine, then the Navy had been looking not for a grave, but for a crew still attempting to reveal where it was trapped. 2 evenings into the public search, listening stations and search units were still straining for any transmission that could transform uncertainty into a location. On May 29, 1968, several search parties reportedly received brief radio traffic that appeared to be connected with the missing submarine. The report came while the operation was still being conducted as a possible rescue, when every unexplained signal had to be examined before time removed whatever chance remained. There was no visual confirmation attached to it and no known vessel waiting at the apparent source, yet the message contained enough to prevent it from being dismissed immediately. Later accounts consistently placed the reception during the evening of May 29th at the height of the search effort. Buried within the weak traffic was the word Brandywine, an operational identifier associated closely enough with Scorpion to demand immediate investigation. A call sign could identify a vessel without requiring its name to be transmitted openly, and hearing the missing submarine's identifier after confirmed contact had ended created an unmistakable possibility. Someone might still be alive. The boat might have suffered a communications failure and only now found a way to transmit. It might be disabled on the surface or submerged within reach of rescue, able to send fragments, but not the complete position searchers needed. If the identification was genuine, the entire meaning of the search changed at once. The presumed route from the Azores toward Norfolk would no longer be merely a corridor along which the submarine might have sunk. It could become the area within which a damaged vessel was waiting to be found. A surviving crew might be conserving power, fighting flooding, or attempting to maintain breathable conditions while transmitting only when equipment and circumstances allowed. None of those possibilities was established by the signal, but the appearance of the codename made them impossible to ignore while the source remained unknown. Multiple receptions made the report harder to dismiss, although repetition alone could not establish who had transmitted it. Later summaries state that several search parties heard the brief message, suggesting that the signal was not confined to one receiver or one operator's interpretation. Yet separate listeners could hear the same unrelated transmission, and a word recognized by several people could still have been distorted traffic, whose actual meaning was different. Radio evidence became persuasive only when identity, content, timing, and origin could be connected, and the May 29th signal never provided all four with certainty. Direction-finding equipment offered a possible way to turn the fleeting signal into coordinates before it disappeared completely. By comparing the bearings from more than one receiving location, searchers could estimate the region from which the transmission might have originated. In theory, intersecting lines would narrow the Atlantic into an area small enough for aircraft and ships to examine. In practice, a weak signal, atmospheric interference, receiver limitations, and imperfect bearings could produce a zone rather than a precise point. The message had lasted only briefly, leaving little opportunity to improve the estimate through repeated contact. Inside the region indicated by the bearings, the Atlantic revealed nothing capable of explaining the transmission. Search forces found no surface submarine, no survivors, no debris field, and no further authenticated message guiding them toward a new position. The source could not be identified within the area derived from the radio bearings, and the promising clue became another uncertainty added to an operation already dominated by them. Recognition was not authentication, especially when static and urgency encouraged listeners to search incomplete sounds for familiar meaning. The codename might have been copied correctly, but transmitted by another naval unit repeating information connected with the search. It might have appeared inside traffic discussing Scorpion rather than originating aboard it. Interference could have changed an unrelated word into something resembling Brandywine, or an unknown transmitter could have used the identifier for reasons the searchers never established. None of those explanations could be proven, but each prevented the signal from becoming reliable evidence of survival. Missing from the brief contact were the details that would have converted hope into an actionable rescue. No verified coordinates placed the crew within a reachable area. No clear report described the submarine's condition, remaining air, depth, or mechanical status. No exchange allowed a naval station to challenge the sender with information only Scorpion could confirm. Most importantly, the signal did not return in a form that searchers could follow. A damaged submarine capable of repeated communication might gradually guide ships toward it, but one isolated identifier offered only the suggestion of a voice without the direction needed to reach it. Officially, the transmission remained an unresolved report rather than proof that the submarine had spoken after disappearing. The May 21st traffic continued to stand as the final confirmed communication because it connected the boat's identity with an accepted position, intentions, and expected arrival. The May 29th signal did none of those things securely. It was never conclusively identified as a hoax, a mistake, or an authentic call from the submarine. It simply failed to cross the evidentiary boundary separating a possible reception from verified contact. Once the unexplained signal failed to return, investigators were left to search for traces that had not been sent deliberately by anyone aboard. Radio listening had produced a word, a set of bearings, and a brief hope that disappeared as quickly as it had formed. Somewhere else within the Navy's vast network, however, instruments designed to monitor sound through the ocean had already captured a sequence no operator initially understood. While searchers waited for another message from the crew, underwater stations had recorded evidence suggesting that the submarine had already passed beyond the reach of radio. Listening for a disaster already recorded. Elsewhere in the Navy's records, a different kind of signal had been preserved without a code name, a position report, or any human attempt to call for help. It did not arrive as a message from Commander Francis Slattery, and no operator could answer it while the submarine was still missing. The evidence had entered the record automatically, carried through deep water to instruments whose purpose was to listen for distant disturbances across the Atlantic. At the moment those sounds were captured, no one yet knew that USS Scorpion would fail to reach Norfolk. Only afterward did the recordings begin to resemble something more disturbing than background noise, the possible acoustic trace of the submarine's final descent. Beneath ordinary Atlantic noise, fixed listening systems continuously collected sounds, produced far beyond the range of ships searching on the surface. During the Cold War, underwater stations were positioned to detect low-frequency acoustic energy associated with submarines, weapons tests, missile impacts, and other significant events. Their hydrophones did not hear the ocean, as a human listener would hear a room. They reduced distant activity to recorded patterns whose meaning depended on comparison, timing, and analysis. A ship could pass through one region, an explosion could occur in another, and the resulting energy might travel through the water until several separated stations registered it. Deep water could carry a sudden acoustic event across distances that no eyewitness, aircraft, or radar could bridge. Temperature and pressure create layers within the ocean through which certain frequencies can travel unusually far, bending rather than fading immediately into the surrounding sea. A violent disturbance southwest of the Azores might therefore be detected by instruments located hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The stations would not produce a photograph or identify the source by name, but the time at which a sound arrived could become a clue to where it began. Days before families gathered at Norfolk, instruments had already registered disturbances from the broad region through which the submarine was believed to be travelling. The Navy later accepted May 22, 1968, as the date on which Scorpion was lost, although the formal emergency did not begin until the boat failed to arrive 5 days later. By then, the acoustic events associated with the disaster were already buried within recorded data separated from the public search by the simple fact that no one had been looking for them when they occurred. At the moment of recording, the disturbances possessed no label connecting them to a missing American boat. Listening systems collected large amounts of information, much of it produced by ordinary shipping, natural seismic activity, distant explosions, biological sources, or equipment effects. Without a known casualty and a narrow time window, an unusual impulse could remain only one event among many. The ocean had made a record, but it had not explained what the record contained. Once the surface search produced no location, attention shifted toward recordings made before anyone knew there was a disaster to find. the Navy formed a technical group under Dr. John Craven, chief scientist of the Deep Submergent Systems project, to help answer two questions that the Air and Surface Search had failed to resolve: where Scorpion was and what might have happened to it. Early checks of the Navy's sound surveillance data reportedly produced little of value, leaving the group with only the last known position and a broad dead reckoning estimate across the Atlantic. Within hours of stored sound, analysts had to identify which disturbances might belong to the missing submarine and which belonged only to the ocean around it. A geophysical hydrophone station operated by Columbia University in the Canary Islands possessed a recording of noises that could be interpreted as a submarine breaking apart, but one recording alone could not establish an exact source. Additional data arrived from other underwater arrays, some of it provided under secrecy that continued long after the loss. Only when the records were compared did the scattered sounds begin to form a pattern rather than a collection of unrelated impulses. The pattern that emerged was not a single clean sound announcing exactly what had happened, but a sequence whose intervals demanded interpretation. One significant acoustic event was followed roughly 91 seconds later by the first of several powerful signals that analysts associated with structural collapse as the submarine descended beyond the depth its pressure hull could withstand. In total, later analysis identified 15 distinct events over approximately 3 minutes, while another station had recorded a smaller disturbance about 20 minutes earlier. Those sounds suggested stages rather than one instantaneous destruction, but they did not reveal with certainty what began the sequence. One part of the record appeared consistent with the catastrophic collapse of enclosed sections under immense pressure. As a damaged submarine descended, the surrounding sea would press harder against the hull until compartments no longer capable of resisting it failed violently. Such an implosion could generate acoustic energy detectable at great distance, leaving a final structural signature after whatever fire, flooding, explosion, or mechanical emergency had already occurred. The recordings could therefore indicate when the boat passed beyond recovery, without explaining the event that first sent it downward. Tiny differences between distant recordings allowed investigators to reverse the journey of the sound and move closer to its origin. If the same event reached several hydrophone stations at slightly different times, analysts could compare those delays and draw curves representing possible source locations. Where the calculations intersected, the immense Atlantic began to contract. The method depended on assumptions about how sound had travelled through the water, so the Navy conducted controlled explosive tests in the suspected region to refine the acoustic model and correct the calculated position. Between June 6th and June 27th, USS Compass Island dropped a series of charges known as submiss shots, allowing the analysts to compare known explosions with the signals believed to be connected to Scorpion. Gradually, the Atlantic ceased to be an unlimited field and became a region defined by intersecting acoustic evidence. The hydrophone record suggested that the loss had occurred hundreds of miles southwest of the Azores, far from the route lines initially searched at the surface. The calculation did not place a visible mark on the seabed, but it gave the searchers something they had lacked since Norfolk, a reason to concentrate on one portion of the deep ocean rather than another. Probability replaced certainty where the recordings could go no further, ranking areas according to how well each fitted the incomplete evidence. Craven's team combined acoustic timing with the submarine's last reported position, probable speed, possible course changes, and the sequence suggested by the recorded events. The resulting search plan did not claim that the wreck lay at one guaranteed coordinate. It treated each section of seabed as more or less likely, allowing a vessel with limited time and equipment to search the highest probability regions first. Over the suspected area, the oceanographic research ship Mizar began tracing methodical paths above water, more than 10,000 feet deep. Equipped with deep-towed cameras, lights, sonar, and magnetic detection equipment, the vessel had to move slowly across planned lines, while instruments travelled far below on long cables. Mizar reached the likely region in June and searched through the summer, repeatedly returning to the Azores before beginning another operation. Official naval history records that the ship ultimately located sections of Scorpion at the end of October, approximately 400 miles southwest of the islands. Each photographic run revealed only a narrow corridor of darkness, leaving most of the surrounding seabed unseen. At that depth, a small error in the ship's position could place the camera far from the intended line. while irregular terrain and limited visibility could hide wreckage just beyond the lights. 4 separate operations passed without producing the answer, even though the acoustic calculations continued to indicate that the search was close. By the 5th operation in October, repeated failure had forced the team to reconsider not the existence of the acoustic evidence, but how the search equipment had been moving across the area it defined. Craven directed Mizar toward a region farther east, more closely aligned with his interpretation of the initial event and the submarine's possible movement before sinking. The ship resumed its slow passes over a seabed that appeared no different from the thousands of square miles already examined. Then one sequence of photographs returned from the deep carrying shapes the Atlantic floor could not have formed naturally. The sounds had narrowed the darkness to a field beneath Mizar, where the first images were beginning to reveal what had waited below since May, what the cameras found below. Inside that narrow field of light, the first manufactured shapes appeared, without revealing how much of the missing submarine still lay beyond the camera's reach. The deep-towed system moved above a seabed more than 10,000 feet below the Atlantic surface, illuminating only a small section at a time before darkness closed again behind it. At first, the images did not present USS Scorpion as a complete vessel waiting to be recognized. They offered fragments whose meaning depended on angle, scale, and comparison, with plans of the submarine that had vanished 5 months earlier. A curve of metal, an opening in the sediment, or a fitting emerging from debris could belong to the wreck, yet each photograph showed too little to explain what lay outside its borders. October 28th turned months of calculation into physical evidence, when the photographs confirmed that the search had crossed the submarine's resting place. The location was roughly 400 miles southwest of the Azores, far beneath the region toward which the acoustic analysis had directed USS Mizar. Until that moment, the Navy had possessed signals, probability estimates, projected tracks, and recorded sounds believed to mark a destruction no one had witnessed. Now there were objects on the ocean floor that could be matched to a skipjack-class submarine. The search had finally answered where Scorpion had gone, but the condition of what appeared in the images immediately made the next question more difficult. No investigator could walk through the wreck or place a hand against the damaged steel, leaving photographs to serve as the first witnesses below. The depth placed the submarine beyond ordinary diving and recovery methods, so every judgment had to be made from pictures captured by equipment moving above the seabed. Lighting flattened some surfaces and threw others into shadow. Sediment concealed edges, while the camera's changing distance altered the apparent size of structures from one frame to the next. Investigators could return to the area and photograph it again, but they could not examine the wreck as they would a vessel brought into dry dock. The evidence remained where the disaster had left it, interpreted through glass, cables, and darkness. Rather than one recognizable boat, the camera encountered separated structures whose original relationship had been broken during the descent. Scorpion was not resting upright with its hull intact and sail rising above it. Major sections had come apart and pieces of the submarine lay distributed across a debris field. The distance between them showed that the vessel had not simply settled gently onto the bottom after losing power. Something had opened the pressure hull, divided the structure, and allowed internal material to escape before or during impact with the seabed. The wreck was visible, but the sequence that produced it remained hidden inside the destruction itself. Most recognizable among the early images was the sail, detached from the position it had occupied during every surfaced arrival. Its familiar outline made identification possible, even though it no longer rose above a streamlined hull. A fair water plane remained visible on one side, while portions of masts projected from the damaged structure. Nearby lay material associated with the operational spaces that had once been enclosed beneath it. The sight of the sail apart from the submarine transformed the loss from an abstract implosion into a physical breakup, yet it did not reveal whether the separation occurred during the first casualty, the downward fall, or the final collapse under pressure. Open spaces interrupted the surviving metal, where enclosed sections and access structures had once protected the compartments beneath them. Plating had been torn away or crushed inward, exposing areas that had never been intended to meet the ocean directly. Some edges appeared violently distorted, while other surfaces retained enough shape to show how sharply the damage changed from one section to another. These openings tempted interpretation, because they seemed to point toward moments of failure, but the wreck had endured several destructive forces in succession. An explosion, flooding, implosion, breakup and impact could all leave different marks upon the same structure, making the first wound difficult to distinguish from everything that followed. Farther along the debris field, the forward portion retained enough familiar structure to make the violence around it more difficult to dismiss. A section of periscope equipment protruded from the damaged hull, placing recognizable machinery within an area where surrounding plating had lost its original form. The bow had once contained the submarine's torpedo room and weapons, spaces built to remain sealed from the sea while holding equipment capable of tremendous destructive force. In the photographs, the forward section appeared not as a complete compartment, but as part of a structure altered by crushing pressure and breakup. Attention inevitably settled on the forward weapon spaces, where damage would later be examined for signs of an accident beginning inside the submarine. The torpedo room became central to theories involving a weapon malfunction or internal explosion, especially because Scorpion carried torpedoes that could threaten both surface and submerged targets. Yet the photographs did not show a single unmistakable blast center that settled the matter. Damage in the bow could support more than one explanation, and the forces acting during descent could have enlarged or transformed whatever occurred earlier. The wreck invited conclusions without allowing any of them to become certain. Every damaged surface carried more than one possible history, because the submarine had endured both the original casualty and the crushing descent that followed. A pipe bent out of place might have failed before the boat began sinking, or it might have been distorted when the pressure hull collapsed. A missing panel could indicate an internal explosion, but it could also have been torn away during breakup. Debris outside the hull proved that compartments had opened, though not necessarily when or why. The deeper investigators looked, the more difficult it became to separate the initiating event from the destruction that erased it. Aft of amidships, recognizable fittings survived beside twisted structures that no longer showed when or why they had failed. Photographs recorded openings associated with the messenger buoy stowage area, ballast tank vents, hatches and damaged piping. Some components remained identifiable because their shape or position matched plans of the submarine, while nearby metal had folded, separated or vanished. The machinery spaces and after portions of the hull had once contained systems essential to propulsion, electrical power and control, but the images could not show which of those systems had been operating normally in the final minutes. Objects once confined behind steel now rested openly in the sediment, turning the seafloor into a broken inventory of the submarine's interior. Pieces of piping, equipment, structural material, and smaller fragments had been expelled from compartments that should have remained sealed. Their distribution suggested violent release rather than orderly separation, though currents and the fall through thousands of feet of water could have moved lighter objects away from their original positions. Each item belonged to a space in which men had worked, slept, or stood watch. Yet the photographs reduced those spaces to scattered remnants, without preserving the human sequence that had occupied them. Taken together, the images showed destruction powerful enough to divide the vessel, yet they preserved no simple order explaining which failure came first. The separated sections and collapsed compartments were consistent with a submarine descending beyond the depth its pressure hull could survive. The debris field also confirmed that the hull had opened catastrophically before everything reached the bottom. Those conclusions explained the scale of the destruction, but they did not identify the event that began it. The photographs recorded the end of the process far more clearly than its beginning. Nothing in the wreck's condition suggested that the 99 men could be recovered from such depth and devastation. The submarine had not remained intact as a sealed tomb that might one day be raised without disturbing the site. Its compartments had collapsed, major structures had separated, and the surrounding pressure made any conventional recovery impossible. The cameras could return, photograph new angles, and examine the reactor and weapons left below, but they could not restore the enclosed world that had carried the crew across the Atlantic. Thousands of frames eventually reached investigators, multiplying the evidence without producing the one image that could settle the mystery. Each photograph could be enlarged, compared with construction drawings, and studied for damage patterns, but no single view captured the entire wreck or preserved the submarine as it had appeared at the moment of failure. The evidence was abundant and incomplete at the same time. It showed what remained after the final collapse, while leaving the initiating casualty obscured by everything that happened afterward. Once the wreck had been documented, the central question moved from the Atlantic floor into rooms where access to the evidence would be tightly controlled. Photographs, engineering interpretations, acoustic records, maintenance histories, and testimony would be examined together, but much of that process would unfold beyond public view. The discovery had ended the uncertainty over whether Scorpion had sunk, yet it had opened a more enduring mystery around why the submarine had been destroyed. The cameras had shown the Navy how completely Scorpion was lost, but determining why would now depend on an inquiry conducted largely beyond public sight. The investigation behind closed doors. Transferred from the darkness below into a restricted naval record, the photographs offered evidence that only a limited number of investigators would be allowed to examine in full. Finding USS Scorpion had answered the question that dominated the search, but it had not made the disaster easier to explain. The wreck lay broken in more than 10,000 feet of water, its major sections separated and its compartments altered by implosion, descent, and impact. Every image appeared to promise a clue, yet no photograph preserved the submarine at the instant when normal operation first became a catastrophe. The Navy now possessed a physical scene, but the meaning of that scene would be decided away from the families, reporters, and public waiting for an answer. Months before those images existed, a panel of naval officers had already begun searching for a cause without knowing exactly where the submarine lay. The Court of Inquiry convened on June 4, 1968, while ships and technical teams were still attempting to locate the wreck, and its initial proceedings continued until July 25th. During that period, the court examined 76 witnesses and considered a broad range of possible explanations using the submarine's operational history, communications, maintenance records, acoustic material then available, and testimony from people familiar with the boat. The investigation began as an attempt to reconstruct a destroyed vessel from everything surrounding it except the vessel itself. No witness could describe the first alarm, the final maneuver, or the condition inside the control room when the voyage ceased to be routine. Every officer and enlisted man aboard had been lost, eliminating the direct testimony that ordinarily allows investigators to establish the sequence of an accident. Former crew members could explain how Scorpion handled, which systems had caused trouble, and how procedures were normally carried out. Shipyard workers and maintenance personnel could discuss repairs, inspections, and deferred work. Submarine officers and technical specialists could describe what particular failures might do at depth, but none had heard the alarms on May 22nd or seen Commander Francis Slattery's final decisions. Records once filed as maintenance problems now returned as possible fragments of a disaster no one had survived to explain. The court could examine the depth restriction reportedly imposed because of valve leakage, the incomplete sub-safe modifications, repair requests, and the reduced overhaul that had returned Scorpion to service before every planned improvement was completed. Each documented deficiency had to be considered in a new context, because something accepted as manageable before deployment might appear more serious after the submarine failed to return. Yet maintenance history could establish only that a weakness existed, not that it became the initiating casualty. A leaking valve, damaged component, or unfinished modification remained a possible clue until evidence linked it directly to the sinking. With no wreckage yet available to eliminate possibilities, nearly every system aboard could be imagined as the place where destruction began. The inquiry considered internal flooding, mechanical failure, structural casualty, fire, battery trouble, an accidental weapon event, and hostile action. A torpedo accident appeared prominently among the possibilities, but the original inquiry reached no definitive conclusion. The range of explanations revealed the court's central problem. A nuclear submarine contained many systems capable of creating a fatal chain of events, while the silence of the crew allowed none of those chains to be followed from beginning to end. By the end of the first hearings, the Navy possessed explanations that were possible but none that could be proven. The court could reject ideas that conflicted with known facts, but it could not identify one surviving piece of evidence that established a certain cause. A Soviet attack required proof of an encounter or weapon impact that the record did not provide. Mechanical theories required a connection between known deficiencies and the final event. Weapons theories required evidence that distinguished an internal detonation from damage created later during collapse. The first proceedings therefore ended with the submarine still missing and the cause suspended among several unresolved possibilities. discovery southwest of the Azores returned the unanswered case to the court with evidence the first proceedings had lacked. After Mizar located sections of the wreck at the end of October, the Court of Inquiry reconvened to examine the photographs and data gathered from the site. The submarine's location could now be compared with acoustic calculations and projected routes, while visible structures could be studied against construction plans and proposed casualty sequences. Even with that expanded record, the Navy's official historical account states that the inquiry did not determine the cause of the loss. Thousands of photographs exposed the submarine's destruction from different angles, yet every damaged section carried the effects of more than one violent event. Investigators could examine the detached sail, the forward section, openings in the hull, scattered equipment, and collapsed compartments. But the wreck had continued changing after the first failure. Water pressure increased during the descent, enclosed spaces imploded, major structures separated, and the remaining sections struck the seabed. A hole visible in one photograph might have formed during the initiating casualty, widened during collapse, or appeared only when the hull broke apart. The more completely the final destruction was documented, the harder it became to isolate the first damage from everything that followed. Almost every path toward the cause crossed information the Navy considered too sensitive for unrestricted disclosure. Scorpion had been a nuclear-powered attack submarine returning from an intelligence assignment, carrying classified equipment, operational capabilities, and nuclear weapons. The acoustic systems that helped locate the wreck belonged to a secret Cold War network intended to detect submarine activity across vast ocean areas, revealing exactly what those stations had recorded, where they were located, or how accurately they could calculate a source might expose American surveillance capabilities to the Soviet Union. Secrecy therefore surrounded not merely the court's conclusions, but many of the instruments and operations required to reach them. Outside the inquiry, official statements revealed the outcome of the investigation without revealing enough of the process to make that outcome persuasive to everyone. Families could be told that the submarine had been found, that all 99 men were lost, and that the evidence did not establish a certain cause. They could not independently inspect every photograph, acoustic record, technical analysis, or classified operational document considered by the court. In late January 1969, the Navy announced that the certain cause of the loss could not be determined from the available evidence, a conclusion that acknowledged uncertainty while providing little relief from it. As restricted records remained inaccessible, uncertainty gradually hardened into suspicion among relatives, researchers, and former submariners. Classification did not by itself prove that the Navy had discovered a cause and concealed it. Legitimate Cold War security concerns existed throughout the case, yet withholding evidence made the official uncertainty difficult to evaluate from outside the service. One writer could argue that the photographs supported a torpedo accident, while another could claim the same secrecy concealed Soviet involvement or dangerous maintenance decisions. Without full access to the record, competing interpretations could accuse one another of overlooking evidence that most readers had never been permitted to see. In the end, the inquiry could explain where Scorpion rested and how completely it had been destroyed, but not what first forced it toward the bottom. The Navy had examined witnesses, operational records, maintenance history, acoustic data, wreck photographs, and technical possibilities, then reconvened the court after the wreck was found. Still, the official history remained unchanged. Despite the quantity of material collected and studied, the cause continued to be a mystery. The investigation had narrowed the field, rejected claims that lacked support, and documented the vessel's destruction, but it could not cross the final distance between aftermath and origin. Where the official conclusion stopped, competing explanations began constructing entirely different versions of the same unseen disaster. The theories that refused to die. Out of the gap left by the inquiry came several versions of the final minutes, each beginning with a different failure inside or outside the submarine. Some placed the first danger in the torpedo room, where a weapon may have activated before it could be launched. Others shifted the origin toward batteries, seawater systems, valves, piping, or machinery whose condition had already raised concern before the deployment. The most deliberate explanation introduced a Soviet attacker moving through the same hidden Cold War world Scorpion had been ordered to observe. Each theory offered a way to enter the blank interval after the final message, yet none could pass through it without encountering evidence that resisted a complete reconstruction. Certain fragments remain fixed regardless of which explanation is chosen, forming a narrow boundary around everything that can still be argued. USS Scorpion sent no authenticated distress call, failed to reach Norfolk, and was lost with 99 men on May 22, 1968. Underwater listening systems recorded a sequence of acoustic events later associated with its destruction, including powerful sounds consistent with structural collapse as the boat descended beyond survivable depth. The wreck was found southwest of the Azores in separate sections, surrounded by debris and damaged by implosion, breakup, and impact. Those facts establish that the submarine suffered a catastrophic casualty and continued downward until the pressure hull failed, but they do not identify what began that descent. Official Navy history still describes the cause as undetermined, noting that the original Court of Inquiry considered numerous possibilities and listed a torpedo accident first among them. Most persistent among the internal explanations is the possibility that one of the submarine's own torpedoes became dangerous before it ever left the tube. Later reconstructions have focused especially on a battery-powered Mark 37 torpedo, proposing that it may have activated unintentionally, overheated, or begun running while still inside the forward weapon spaces. A live torpedo operating within a sealed submarine would create several dangers at once: heat, electrical trouble, fire, and the possibility that its warhead could detonate before the crew could disable it. Some versions suggest that Scorpion may have maneuvered in an effort to activate a weapon's safety mechanisms or prevent it from striking the hull, but no surviving record proves that Commander Slattery ordered such a turn. The maneuver exists as part of the reconstruction, not as an established final action witnessed from shore. Support for that scenario comes less from one decisive photograph than from the way several incomplete clues can be arranged around it. The Court of Inquiry regarded a torpedo accident as sufficiently plausible to place it first among the possible causes, and the acoustic sequence can be interpreted as an initial destructive event followed by a delay before the hull's terminal collapse. A serious casualty in the forward section might disable systems, open the hull to flooding, or leave the boat descending while the crew attempted to regain control. The absence of a distress call would also fit an emergency that developed rapidly or occurred while the submarine was too deep to transmit. Yet none of those points uniquely identifies a torpedo. They demonstrate that such an accident could produce a fatal chain, not that one certainly did. Doubt enters when the proposed explosion is compared with a wreck whose visible damage refuses to identify one undeniable blast center. The forward section was badly damaged, but the submarine had also imploded, broken apart during descent, and struck the seabed at enormous depth. Those later forces could obscure the marks of an earlier internal explosion or create damage that resembles one. Critics of the torpedo theory have argued that the photographs do not display clear evidence of a weapon detonation, fire, or rupture originating in the torpedo room. A detailed US Naval Institute analysis likewise concluded that the images did not indicate an external torpedo strike or collision, while noting the absence of evidence that the Soviet group had launched weapons. The photographs therefore neither provide the clean confirmation the theory needs, nor erase the possibility that its most important traces were destroyed during collapse. Another explanation moves the first emergency away from the weapon spaces and into the electrical systems that remained essential even aboard a nuclear-powered boat. Scorpion carried large batteries that could provide emergency electrical power and support critical functions when normal generation was interrupted. Batteries can release hydrogen during operation and charging, which is why ventilation and monitoring are vital within enclosed compartments. If hydrogen accumulated and ignited, the resulting blast could produce fire, injure personnel, damage electrical equipment, or interrupt systems needed to control the submarine. A severe battery casualty might therefore begin quietly as a ventilation or electrical problem, before becoming an emergency that spread beyond the compartment where it started. Its difficulty lies in scale, because an event capable of starting chaos was not necessarily powerful enough to create everything later recorded. Congressional discussion of the inquiry stated that the court doubted a hydrogen explosion alone could generate enough force to rupture Scorpion's hull, although it did not entirely exclude a battery event from the broader chain of possible failures. A blast might disable equipment, start a fire, interrupt propulsion, or prevent the crew from maintaining depth without being the direct force that divided the submarine. The theory can therefore explain an initiating emergency more easily than the final breakup. To become complete, it must add further steps: loss of control, descent, flooding, and eventual implosion, none of which can be verified from surviving records. A less dramatic reconstruction begins with seawater entering through a vulnerable system and turning a manageable defect into a chain the crew could not stop. Submarines contain numerous pipes, valves, fittings, and openings that connect internal systems with the sea while still protecting the pressure hull. Failure in one of those paths can become more severe with depth because external pressure forces water inward with increasing power. Scorpion's maintenance history included reported valve leakage, an operating depth restriction, deferred safety modifications, and concerns about the material condition of the boat. Those facts make flooding or mechanical failure plausible without proving which component, if any, failed during the final voyage. Such a scenario requires no single enormous explosion, only several systems failing faster than 99 men could restore control. Water entering through a failed valve, pipe, or disposal opening could create electrical shorts, affect trim, disable machinery, or force the submarine into a downward angle. Loss of propulsion or control surfaces could then prevent the crew from arresting the descent, while the growing pressure made the original leak increasingly difficult to isolate. A flooding theory involving the trash disposal system has often been proposed because such an opening penetrated the pressure hull and could, under the wrong circumstances, admit seawater. Congressional discussion described a trash disposal unit flood as one possible beginning of a succession of material and systemic failures in an already weakened vessel, but it remained a reconstruction rather than an established finding. Proof disappears at the exact component that would matter most, because the descent destroyed much of the machinery capable of identifying the first breach. The wreck photographs could show collapsed compartments, separated plating, and exposed internal material, but many valves, pipes, electrical panels and controls had been crushed or displaced beyond useful interpretation. Known weaknesses establish that Scorpion possessed points of vulnerability. They do not establish that one of them opened on May 22nd. The same distinction applies to propulsion or steering failure. A jammed control surface, shaft problem, or mechanical casualty could help explain an uncontrollable descent, but no surviving log records the first malfunction, and no intact component on the seabed carries a readable history of what occurred before implosion. Cold War rivalry supplies the most deliberate explanation, placing another submarine or naval force on the unseen side of the disaster. Scorpion had recently been diverted to observe Soviet vessels near the Canary Islands, and both navies conducted secretive operations in which submarines attempted to locate, trail, and study one another. Later claims proposed that the Soviets detected Scorpion, pursued it, collided with it, or destroyed it in retaliation for the loss of the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129. Such theories draw strength from the secrecy surrounding submarine intelligence and from the knowledge that rival boats sometimes operated at dangerously close distances without public acknowledgement. Secrecy keeps that possibility alive more effectively than physical evidence does, because missing records can be made to conceal almost any encounter. No authenticated distress transmission from Scorpion reported attack or collision. No publicly established Soviet torpedo signature has been tied to the recorded acoustic sequence, and the wreck photographs do not show clear evidence of an external weapon strike. A US Naval Institute review noted that American intelligence detected no unusual communications from the Soviet group, that the acoustic network did not record a torpedo explosion near the wreck site, and that Scorpion was found hundreds of miles from the Soviet vessels it had been assigned to observe. Official naval history acknowledges Soviet attack as one of many theories, but continues to classify the loss as an accident of unknown cause. Set beside one another, the theories explain different portions of the evidence while leaving the decisive first event beyond recovery. A torpedo casualty fits the court's early concern and could account for sudden internal damage, but the photographs do not provide the unmistakable confirmation its supporters seek. A battery explosion offers a credible source of fire and electrical disruption, yet appears insufficient by itself to rupture the hull. Flooding or mechanical failure aligns with documented vulnerabilities and could produce a descending chain of casualties, but the exact breach was destroyed with the submarine. Soviet involvement supplies motive, secrecy, and Cold War danger, but lacks the public physical and acoustic evidence needed to establish an attack. The recordings preserve the violent end of the sequence, while the wreck preserves its aftermath, leaving the beginning known only to the men who were there. Whatever began the descent vanished with the men who experienced it, leaving the wreck to preserve their resting place but not the answer they carried down. the submarine that kept its last secret. Only the men inside the hull knew which alarm sounded first, and the depth that preserved their resting place also placed that knowledge beyond recovery. Every theory constructed afterward began outside USS Scorpion, using recordings, photographs, maintenance files, and calculations left behind on land. The true sequence belonged to the 99 men who experienced it, from the first indication of trouble to the final moment when the pressure hull could no longer protect them. Their submarine was eventually found, but the one form of evidence capable of resolving every dispute, the testimony of someone who had been there, never returned with it. Locating the wreck ended one disappearance while leaving the more important absence untouched. On a chart, the Navy could mark the place where Scorpion rested, roughly 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. Cameras could descend and confirm the broken sail, separated hull sections, and debris scattered across the Atlantic floor. The date of loss could be fixed as May 22, 1968, and the destructive sequence could be traced through acoustic recordings. Yet none of those discoveries recovered the decisions made inside the submarine after its final communication, or revealed which system first turned against the crew. The boat had been located in physical space while its final minutes remained missing. More than 10,000 feet of water separate the crew from the shore where their return had once been expected. At that depth, the wreck exists beyond ordinary visitation, conventional recovery, or the kind of burial place families can approach directly. The distance is not measured only from Norfolk to the Azores, but vertically through miles of ocean that prevent the site from becoming a grave in the familiar sense. The men remain aboard or within the wreck field, surrounded by the pressure and darkness that concealed the submarine long after the search ended. Within the submarine community, the 99 were remembered not simply as sailors whose deployment ended in disaster, but as men remaining on eternal patrol. The expression gives permanence to voyages that never concluded with a return to port, linking Scorpion's crew with other submariners lost beneath waters no rescue could reach. It avoids pretending that the missing men merely disappeared from naval history. Their names continue to be spoken at ceremonies, preserved in memorials, and carried within a service whose members understood how quickly a submerged patrol could become inaccessible to everyone above. Norfolk eventually gave the loss a visible place on land, close to the naval world from which the submarine had departed. The Scorpion Memorial at Naval Station Norfolk created a fixed point for remembrance where no wreckage or individual graves could do so. The location returned the story to the place where families had once waited for the submarine to enter the harbour, but expectation had been replaced by names and dates. What the Atlantic withheld could at least be represented there, not as a solution to the mystery, but as recognition that the loss belonged to 99 separate lives rather than a single entry in a naval record. Half a century after the missed arrival, relatives and submariners still gathered around the names of men whose final experience remained unknown. On May 26, 2018, more than 500 family members, friends and submariners assembled at the memorial for the 50th anniversary of the loss. Some had lived through the days when the submarine was only overdue, others belonged to generations born after the wreck had already been found. Their gathering showed that uncertainty had not weakened the connection to the crew. It had extended the unanswered story across decades, allowing children and grandchildren to inherit questions the first investigation had been unable to close. No procession brought the crew home, and no cemetery received the remains of the men whose families had waited at the pier. The wreck became their final resting place because the depth, collapse, and widespread destruction made recovery impractical. That absence denied families many of the rituals by which loss becomes physically undeniable. There were no individual coffins to follow, no graves into which personal remains could be placed, and no final return that separated the dangerous world of the submarine from the ordinary world ashore. Instead, remembrance had to form around an inaccessible location hundreds of miles from land. Every later examination of the wreck crossed an uneasy boundary between investigating a naval disaster and entering a place of burial. Cameras and instruments returned to document the hull, inspect the reactor area, and observe what time had changed on the seabed. But the site was never merely technical evidence. The broken compartments had once contained the men whose names appeared at Norfolk. Each image that offered engineers another angle on the destruction also looked into the place where the crew had remained since May 1968. The wreck could be measured, mapped, and monitored without losing the human meaning of what lay among its scattered sections. Declassification opened portions of the record without opening the final compartment of the story. Official histories, inquiry findings, photographs, and later analyses allowed outsiders to examine far more than the families had been given immediately after the loss. Researchers could compare theories, challenge earlier conclusions, and question how evidence had been interpreted. Still, wider access did not produce one explanation accepted by the Navy, technical specialists, former submariners, and relatives alike. More information exposed contradictions that secrecy had once concealed, but it could not recreate evidence destroyed when the hull collapsed. The case endures because it denies the usual comfort offered by discovery. Many maritime mysteries remain powerful because the vessel is never found, leaving its fate somewhere within an unlimited field of possibility. Scorpion presents the opposite problem. Its position is known, its wreck has been photographed, the date and general location of its destruction are established, and the acoustic record preserves part of the final sequence. Even so, the most important question remains where it was before the wreck was located, beyond reach, obscured by the violence that followed it. The final transmission still marks the last instant when Scorpion could describe its own movement, before every later account had to be constructed by someone ashore. At that moment, the submarine reported no emergency and continued toward a destination its crew expected to reach. Everything afterward came from instruments that heard but did not understand, cameras that revealed destruction without cause, and investigators who could examine the remains but not the experience inside them. The final message, therefore, remains disturbing not because of anything alarming it contained, but because it gave no indication that the submarine's next silence would never end. USS Scorpion still lies beneath the Atlantic with 99 men aboard, and the one answer that could end its mystery remains sealed somewhere inside, the moment no one survived to describe.